Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. Read by Alexander Devenport for Rachel Mary. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you would expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde, and had nearly twice the amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent most of her time craning over fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, for their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think that they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursley-ish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on a dull, grey Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out the most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large, tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tack," chortled Mr. Dudley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar: a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been the trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove across town, he was thinking of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get the next day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't looking young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later Mr. Dursley arrived at the Grunnings car park, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window of his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owl swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed, open-mouthed, as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl even in the night-time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road and buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. He'd forgotten all about the people in the cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This lot were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past him, clutching a large doughnut in his bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying.
"The Potters, that's right. That's what I heard." "Yes, their son, Harry."
Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers, as if he wanted to say something to them, but he thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his moustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there was lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. He might have been called Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset by any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight past someone just outside the door.
"Sorry,"
he grunted, as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset about being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you-know-who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted this morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around his eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior, Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about the next door's problems with her daughter, and how Dudley had learnt a new word. "Shan't." Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dursley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news.
"And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving rather unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in the daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why these owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern."
The newsreader allowed himself a grin.
"Most mysterious. And now over to Jim Guffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim?"
"Well, Ted," said the weatherman, "I don't know about that, but it's not only owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain I promised yesterday, they had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight." Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying at daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper A whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. I'll have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously.
Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you?
As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretend she didn't have a sister.
No, she said sharply. Why?
Funny stuff, wasn't it, news? Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars. And there were a lot of funny people in the town today.
So? Snapped Mrs. Dursley.
Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her lot.
Mrs. Dursley sipped her cup of tea through her pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't care. Instead, he said, as casually as he could,
"Their son, he'd be about Dudley's age right now, wouldn't he?"
"I suppose so," said Mrs. Dursley stiffly.
"What's his name again? Howard, isn't it?"
"Harry. Nasty, common name, if you ask me."
"Oh, yeah,"
said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly.
"Yes, I quite agree."
He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bedroom, Mr. Dursley crept into the bedroom window and peered down the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as if it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out there that they were related to a pair of... Well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought of them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat outside on the wall was showing no signs of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Pivot Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car slammed in the next street, or when the 2 owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently, you might have thought that he'd just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched, and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had been seen in Pivot Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak which swept the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind the half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something. But he did seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was staring at him from the other side of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He had found what he had been looking for inside his pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the "put outer," until the only lights left in the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks in the darkness, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down in the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the "put outer" back inside his cloak and set off down the street, towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it.
"Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall."
He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses exactly in the shape of the markings the cat had around its eyes. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled.
"How did you know it was me?" she asked.
"My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly."
"You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall.
"All day when you could have been celebrating? I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here."
Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily.
"Oh yes, everyone's celebrating all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be a bit more careful, but no, even the muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news."
She jerked her hand back at Dursley's dark living room window.
"I heard it. Flocks of our shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars in Kent. I bet it was Daedalus Dingle. She never had much sense."
"You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "We've had precious little time to celebrate for 11 years.
"I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably. "But there's no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright callous. Out on the street in the broad daylight, not even dressed in muggle clothes, swapping rumours."
She threw a sharp sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping he would be telling her something, but he didn't. So she went on.
"A fine thing it would be if, on the day you knew who seems to have disappeared at last, the muggles found out about us all. I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore?"
"It certainly seems so," said Dumbledore. "We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a lemon sherbet?"
"A what?"
"A lemon sherbet. They're a kind of muggled sweet. I'm rather fond of them."
"No, thank you," said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for lemon sherbets. "As I say, even if you-know-who has gone—"
"My dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense. For 11 years I have been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort."
Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 lemon sherbets, seemed not to notice.
"It all gets too confusing if you keep on saying you-know-who. I have never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name."
"I know you haven't,"
said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring.
"But you are different. Everyone knows you're the only you-know... Oh, all right, Voldemort was frightened of."
"You flatter me," said Dumbledore calmly. "Voldemort had powers I will never have."
"Only because you're too, well, noble to use them."
"It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs."
Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, "The owls are nothing to the rumours that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying? About why he's disappeared? About what finally stopped him?" It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached the point she was most anxious to discuss, the real reason she had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day. For neither as a cat nor a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another sherbet lemon and did not answer.
"What they are saying," she pressed on, "is that last night Voldemort turned up in Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumour is that Lily and James Potter that they're dead."
Dumbledore bowed his head.
Professor McGonagall gasped. "Lily and James? I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus."
Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder.
I know,"
he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on.
"That's not all. They're saying that he tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why or how, but they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power suddenly broke, and that's why he's gone.
Dumbledore nodded glumly.
It's true, faltered Professor McGonagall. After all he's done, after all the people he's killed, he couldn't kill a little boy. It's just astounding, all the things to stop him. But how in the name of heaven did Harry survive?
We can only guess, said Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor McGonagall pulled out a lace handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore took a great sniff as he took a golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving around the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose it was he who told you I'd be here, by the way.
Yes, said Professor McGonagall. And I don't suppose you're going to tell me why? Why you're here, of all places?
I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left now.
You can't mean the people who live here.
Jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4.
Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find 2 people who are less like us, and they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here.
It's the best place for him, said Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter.
A letter?
Repeated Professor McGonagall faintly, sitting back on her wall.
Really, Dumbledore? You think that you can explain all of this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in our world will know his name.
Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very seriously over the top of his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he can walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better off he'll be growing up away from all of that until he's ready to take it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth, changed her mind, swallowed, and then said,
Yes, you're right, of course. But how is the boy getting here, Dumbledore?
She eyed his cloak suddenly, as though she thought he might be hiding Harry beneath it. Hagrid's bringing him.
You think it wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this?
I would trust Hagrid with my life.
I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly. But you can't pretend he's not careless. He does tend to... What was it?
A low rumbling sound had broken the silence around him. It grew steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign of a headlight. It swelled to a roar as they both looked up in the sky, and a huge motorbike fell out of the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorbike was huge, it was nothing to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man, and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. Long tangles of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face. He had hands the size of dustbin lids, and his feet in the leather boots were like baby dolphins. In his vast, muscular arms, he was holding a bundle of blankets. "Hagrid," said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. "At last. And where did you find that motorbike?"
"Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir,"
said the giant, climbing carefully off the motorbike as he spoke.
"Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got him, sir."
"No problems, were they?"
"No, sir. House was almost destroyed, but I got him out all right before the Muggles started swarming around. He fell asleep as we were flying over Bristol."
Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a baby boy, fast asleep. Under the tuft of jet-black hair, over his forehead, they could see a curiously shaped cut, like a bolt of lightning.
"Is that where?"
whispered Professor McGonagall. "Yes," said Dumbledore. "He'll have that scar forever."
"Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore?"
"Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in useful.
I have one just above my left knee, which is a perfect map of the London Underground. Well, give him here, Hagrid. We'd better get this over with. Dumbledore took Harry in his arms and turned towards the Dursleys' house.
Could I say good-bye to him, sir?
Asked Hagrid.
He bent his great shaggy head over Harry and gave him what must have been a very scratchy, whiskery kiss. Then suddenly Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog.
"Shh!" hissed Professor McGonagall.
"You'll wake up the Muggles."
"Sorry," sobbed Hagrid, taking out a large spotted handkerchief and burying his face in it. I can't stand it. Lily and James dead, and poor little Harry off to live with Muggles."
Yes, it's very sad, but get a grip on yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be found," Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Hagrid gingerly on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden wall and walked to the front door. He laid Harry gently on the doorstep, took a letter out of his cloak, tucked it inside Harry's blankets, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute the three of them stood and looked at the little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling light that usually shone out of Dumbledore's eyes seems to have gone out.
"Well," said Dumbledore finally, "that's it. We've got no business staying here. We may as well go and join the celebrations."
"Yeah," said Hagrid in a very muffled voice. "I'll be taking Sirius's bike back. Good night, Professor McGonagall. Professor Dumbledore, sir."
Wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Hagrid swung himself onto the motorbike and kicked the engine into life. With a roar, it rose into the air and off into the night. "I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall," said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked back down the street. On the corner, he stopped and took out the silver put-outer. He clicked it once, and 12 balls of light sped back up into their street lamps, so that Pivot Drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make out a tabby cat slinking around the corner at the other end of the street. He could just make out a bundle of blankets on the step of number 4. "Good luck, Harry." He turned on his heel, and with a swish of his cloak, he was gone. A breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Pivot Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sky. The very last place you would expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over in his blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him, and he slept on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He wouldn't know that at this very moment people were meeting in the street all over the country and were holding up glasses and saying in hushed voices, "To Harry Potter, the boy who lived." Chapter 2. The Vanishing Glass. Nearly 10 years had passed since the Dursleys had woken up to find their nephew on the front step, but Pivot Drive had hardly changed at all. The sun rose on the same tidy front gardens and lit up the brass number 4 on the Dursleys' front door. It crept into their living room, which was almost exactly the same as it had been on the night when Mr. Dursley had seen that fateful news report about the owls. Only the photographs on the mantelpiece really showed how much time had passed. 10 years ago, there had been a lot of pictures of what looked like a large pink beach ball wearing different-coloured bauble hats. But Dudley Dursley was no longer a baby, and now the photos showed a large blonde boy riding his first bicycle, on a roundabout at the fair, playing a computer game with his father, being hugged and kissed by his mother. The room held no sign at all that another boy lived in the house too. Yet Harry Potter was still there. Asleep at the moment, but not for long. His Aunt Petunia was awake, and it was her shrill voice which made the first noise of the day. "Get up! Up! Get up! Now!" Harry woke with a start. His aunt rapped on the door again. "Up!" she screamed. Harry heard her towards the kitchen, and then the sound of the frying pan being put on the cooker.
He rolled onto his back and tried to remember the dream he had been having. It was a good one. There had been a flying motorbike in it. He had a funny feeling he'd had the same dream before. His aunt was back outside the door.
"Are you up yet?"
she demanded.
"Nearly," said Harry. "Well, get a move on. I want you to look after the bacon, and don't you dare burn it. I want everything perfect on Dudley's birthday."
Harry groaned.
"What did you say?"
His aunt snapped through the door.
"Nothing, nothing."
Dudley's birthday. How could he have forgotten? Harry got slowly out of his bed and started looking for socks. He found a pair under his bed and, after pulling a spider off one of them, put them on. Harry was used to spiders, because the cupboard under the stairs was full of them, and that was where he slept. When he was dressed, he went down the hall into the kitchen. The table was almost hidden beneath all of Dudley's birthday presents. It looked as though Dudley had got the new computer he wanted, not to mention the second television and the racing bike. Exactly why Dudley wanted a racing bike was a mystery to Harry, as Dudley was very fat and hated exercise. Unless, of course, it involved punching somebody. Dudley's favourite punch bag was Harry, but he couldn't often catch him. Harry didn't look it, but he was very fast. Perhaps it had something to do with living in a dark cupboard. But Harry had always been small and skinny for his age. He looked even smaller and skinnier than he really was because all he had to wear was some old clothes of Dudley's, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than he was. Harry had a thin face, knobbly knees, black hair, and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses, held together with a lot of sellotape because of all the times Dudley had punched him in the nose. The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was the very thin scar on his forehead, which was shaped like a bolt of lightning. He had had it for as long as he could remember, and the first question that he could remember asking Aunt Petunia was how he got it.
"In the car crash when your parents died," she had said. "And don't ask questions."
Don't ask questions. That was the very first rule for a quiet life with the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon entered the kitchen as Harry was turning over the bacon. "Comb your hair!" he barked, by way of a morning greeting. About once a week, Uncle Vernon looked over the top of his newspaper and shouted that Harry needed a haircut. Harry must have had more haircuts than the rest of the boys in his class put together, but it made no difference. His hair simply grew that way, all over the place. Harry was frying eggs by the time Dudley arrived in the kitchen with his mother. Dudley looked a lot like Uncle Vernon. He had a large pink face, not much neck, small, watery blue eyes, and thick blonde hair that lay smoothly on his thick, fat head. Aunt Petunia often said that Dudley looked like a baby angel. Harry often said that Dudley looked like a pig in a wig. Harry put the plates of egg and bacon on the table, which was difficult as there wasn't much room. Dudley, meanwhile, was counting his presents. His face fell.
36,
he said, looking at his mother and father.
"That's 2 less than last year. Darling, you haven't counted Auntie Marge's present. See? It's here, under the big one from Mummy and Daddy." "All right, 37 then,"
said Dudley, going red in the face. Harry, who could see a large Dudley tantrum coming on, began wolfing down his bacon as fast as possible in case Dudley turned the table over. Aunt Petunia obviously scented danger too, because she said quickly, "And we'll buy you another 2 presents while we're out today. How's that, Pumpkin? 2 more presents, isn't that right?" Dudley thought for a moment. It looked like hard work. Finally, he said slowly,
"So I'll have 39, sweetums," said Aunt Petunia. "Oh."
Dudley sat down heavily and grabbed the nearest parcel.
"All right, then."
Uncle Vernon chuckled.
"Little Tyke wants his money worth, just like his father. Attaboy, Dudley."
He ruffled Dudley's hair. At that moment the telephone rang, and Aunt Petunia went to answer it while Harry and Uncle Vernon watched Dudley unwrap the racing bike, a cine camera, a remote-control airplane, 16 new computer games, and a video recorder. He was ripping the paper off a gold wristwatch when Aunt Petunia came back from the telephone, looking both angry and worried.
"Bad news, Vernon," she said. "Mrs. Fig's broken her leg. She can't take him."
She jerked her head in Harry's direction. Dudley's mouth fell open in horror, but Harry's heart gave a leap. Every year, on Dudley's birthday, his parents took him and a friend out for the day, to adventure parks, hamburger bars, or the cinema. Every year, Harry was left behind with Mrs. Figg, a mad old lady who lived 2 streets away. Harry hated it there. The whole house smelled of cabbage, and Mrs. Figg made him look at all the photographs of all the cats she'd ever owned.
"Now what?"
said Aunt Petunia, looking furiously at Harry as though he'd planned this. Harry knew he'd ought to feel sorry that Mrs. Figg had broken her leg, but it wasn't easy when he reminded himself it would be a whole year before he had to look at Tibbles, Snowy, Mr. Pauls, and Mr. Tufty again. "We could phone Marge," Uncle Vernon suggested.
"Don't be silly, Vernon. She hates the boy."
The Dursleys often spoke about Harry like this, as though he wasn't there, or rather as though he was something very nasty that couldn't understand them, like a slug. "What about what's-her-name? Your friend, Yvonne?"
"On holiday. In Majorca,"
slapped Aunt Petunia. You could just leave me here," Harry put in hopefully. He'd be able to watch what he wanted on television for a change, and maybe even go on to Dudley's computer. Aunt Petunia looked as though she'd just swallowed a lemon.
"And come back and find the house in ruins?"
she snarled. "I won't blow up the house," said Harry. But they weren't listening.
"I suppose we could take him to the zoo,"
said Aunt Petunia, slowly.
"And leave him in the car."
"That car's new. He's not sitting in it alone." Dudley began to cry loudly. In fact, he wasn't really crying. It hadn't been years since he'd really cried. But he knew that if he screwed up his face and wailed, his mother would give him anything he wanted.
"Dinky Dildums, don't cry. Mummy won't let you spoil your special day," she cried, flinging her arms around him. "I don't want him to come," Dudley yelled between huge pretend sobs. "He always spoils everything."
He shot Harry a nasty grin through the gap in his mother's arms. Just then the doorbell rang.
"Oh, good Lord, they're here,"
said Aunt Petunia frantically. And a moment later, Dudley's best friend, Piers Pocus, walked in with his mother. Piers was a scrawny boy with a face like a rat. He was usually the one who held people's arms behind their backs while Dudley hit them. Dudley stopped pretending to cry at once. Half an hour later, Harry, who couldn't believe his luck, was sitting in the back of the Dursleys' car with Piers and Dudley on the way to the zoo for the first time in his life. His aunt and uncle hadn't been able to think of anything else to do with him, but before they'd left, Uncle Vernon had taken Harry aside. "I'm warning you," he had said, putting his large purple face right up close to Harry's. "I'm warning you now, boy. Any funny business, anything at all, and you'll be in the cupboard from now till Christmas." "But I'm not going to do anything," said Harry. "Honestly." But Uncle Vernon didn't believe him. No one ever did. The problem was, strange things often happened around Harry, and it was no good telling the Dursleys he didn't make them happen. Once, Aunt Petunia, tired of Harry coming back from the barber's looking as though he hadn't been at all, had taken a pair of kitchen scissors and cut his hair so short he was almost bald, except for his fringe, which she left to hide the horrible scar. Dudley had laughed himself silly at Harry, who spent a sleepless night imagining school the next day, where he was already laughed at for his baggy clothes and sellotaped glasses. Next morning, however, he had got up to find his hair exactly as it had been before Aunt Petunia had sheared it off. He had been given a week in his cupboard for this, even though he had tried to explain that he couldn't explain how it had grown back so quickly. Another time, Aunt Petunia had tried to force him into a revolting old jumper of Dursley's, brown with orange baubles. The harder she tried to pull it over his head, the smaller it seemed to become, until finally it might have fitted a glove puppet, but certainly wouldn't fit Harry. Aunt Petunia had decided it must have shrunk in the wash, and to his great relief, Harry wasn't punished. On the other hand, he'd gotten into terrible trouble for being found on the roof of the school kitchens. Dudley's gang had been chasing him, as usual when, as so much as Harry's surprise as anyone else's, there he was sitting on the chimney. The Dursleys had received a very angry letter from Harry's headmistress, telling them Harry had been climbing school buildings. But all he tried to do, as he shouted at Uncle Vernon through the locked door of his cupboard, was jump behind the big bins outside the kitchen doors. Harry supposed that the wind must have caught him in mid-jump. But today nothing was going to go wrong. It was even worth being with Dudley and Piers to be spending the day somewhere that wasn't school, his cupboard, or Mrs. Figg's cabbage-smelling living room. While he drove, Uncle Vernon complained to Aunt Petunia. He liked to complain about things. People at work, Harry, the council, Harry, the bank, and Harry were just a few of his favourite subjects. This morning it was motorbikes. "Roaring along like maniacs, the young hoodlums," he said as a motorbike overtook them. "I had a dream about a motorbike," said Harry, remembering suddenly. "It was flying." Uncle Vernon suddenly crashed into the car in front. He turned right around in his seat and yelled at Harry, his face like a gigantic beetroot with a moustache. "Motorbikes don't fly!" Dudley and Pierce sniggered. I know they don't," said Harry. "It was only a dream." But he wished he hadn't said anything. If there was one thing the Dursleys hated even more than his asking questions, it was his talking about anything acting in a way it shouldn't. No matter if it was in a dream or even in a cartoon, they seemed to think it might get dangerous ideas. It was a very sunny Saturday, and the zoo was crowded with families. The Dursleys brought Dudley and Pierce large chocolate ice creams at the entrance, and then, because the smiling lady in the van had asked Harry what he wanted before they could hurry him away, they bought him a cheap lemon-iced lolly. It wasn't bad either, Harry thought, licking it as they watched a gorilla scratching its head and looking remarkably like Dudley, except that it wasn't blonde. Harry had had the best morning he'd had in a long time. He was careful to walk a little way apart from the Dursleys so that Dudley and Pierce, who were starting to get bored with the animals by lunchtime, wouldn't fall back on their favourite hobby of hitting him. They ate in the zoo restaurant, and when Dudley had had a tantrum because his Knickerbocker glory wasn't big enough, Uncle Vernon brought him another one, and Harry was allowed to finish the first. Harry felt afterwards that he should have known it was all too good to last. After lunch, they went to the reptile house. It was cool and dark in here, with lit windows all along the walls. Behind the glass, all sorts of lizards and snakes were crawling and slithering over the bits of wood and stone. Dudley and Piers wanted to see huge poisonous cobras and thick man-crushing pythons. Dudley quickly found the largest snake in the place. It could have wrapped its body twice around Uncle Vernon's car and crushed it into a dustbin. But at the moment it didn't look in the mood. In fact, it was fast asleep. Dudley stood with his nose pressed against the glass, staring at the glistening brown coils. "Make it move," he whined at his father. Uncle Vernon tapped on the glass, but the snake didn't budge. "Do it again," Dudley ordered. Uncle Vernon rapped the glass smartly with his knuckles, but the snake just snoozed on. "This is boring," Dudley moaned, and shuffled away. Harry moved in front of the tank and looked intently at the snake. He wouldn't have been surprised if it had died of boredom itself. No company except stupid people drumming their fingers on the glass trying to disturb it all day long. It was worse than having a cupboard as a bedroom, where the only visitor was Aunt Petunia hammering on the door to wake you up. At least he got to visit the rest of the house. The snake suddenly opened its beady eyes. Slowly, very slowly, it raised its head until its eyes were on a level with Harry's. It winked. Harry stared. Then he looked quickly around to see if anyone was watching. They weren't. He looked back at the snake and winked too. The snake jerked its head towards Uncle Vernon and Dudley, then raised its eyes to the ceiling. It gave Harry a look that said, quite plainly, "I get that all the time." "I know," Harry murmured through the glass, though he wasn't sure if the snake could hear him. "It must be very annoying." The snake nodded vigorously. "Where do you come from, anyway?" Harry asked. The snake jabbed its tail at a little sign next to the glass. Harry peered at it. Boa constrictor, Brazil.
Was it nice there?
The boa constrictor jabbed its tail at the sign again, and Harry read on. This specimen was bred in the zoo.
Oh, I see. You've never been to Brazil.
As the snake shook its head, a deafening shout behind Harry made both of them jump.
Dudley! Mr. Dursley! Come and look at this snake! You won't believe what it's doing!
Dudley came waddling towards them as fast as he could.
Out of the way, you!
He said, punching Harry in the ribs. Caught by surprise, Harry fell hard on the concrete floor. What came next happened so fast no one saw how it happened. 1 second, Piers and Dudley were leaning right up close to the glass. The next, they had leapt back with howls of horror. Harry sat up and gasped. The glass from the boa constrictor's tank had vanished. The great snake was uncoiling itself rapidly, slithering out onto the floor. People throughout the reptile house screamed and started running towards the exits. As the snake slid swiftly past them, Harry could have sworn a low hissing voice said,
Brazil, here I come. Thanks, amigo.
The keeper of the reptile house was in shock.
What, the glass?
He kept on saying.
Where did the glass go?
The zoo director himself made Aunt Petunia a cup of strong, sweet tea, while he apologized over and over again. Piers and Dudley could only gibber. As far as Harry had seen, the snake hadn't done anything except snapped playfully at their heels as it passed. But by the time they were all back in Uncle Vernon's car, Dudley was telling them how it had nearly bitten off his leg, while Pierce was swearing it had tried to squeeze him to death. But worst of all, for Harry at least, was Piers calming down enough to say,
Harry was talking to it, weren't you, Harry?
Uncle Vernon waited until Pierce was safely out of the house before starting on Harry. He was so angry he could hardly speak. He managed to say, Go! Cupboard! Stay! No meals! Before he collapsed in a chair, and Aunt Petunia had to run and get him a large brandy. Harry lay in his dark cupboard much later, wishing he had a watch. He didn't know what time it was, and he couldn't be sure the Dursleys were asleep yet. Until they were, he couldn't risk sneaking into the kitchen for food. He'd lived with the Dursleys almost 10 years. 10 miserable years, as long as he could remember, ever since he'd been a baby, and his parents had died in that car crash. He couldn't remember being in the car when his parents had died. Sometimes when he strained his memory during long hours in the cupboard, he came up with a strange vision, a blinding flash of green light and a burning pain on his forehead. This, he supposed, was the crash, though he couldn't imagine where all the green light came from. He couldn't remember his parents at all. His aunt and uncle never spoke about them, and of course he was forbidden to ask questions. There were no photographs of them in the house. When he had been younger, Harry had dreamed and dreamed of some unknown relation coming to take him away, but it had never happened. The Dursleys were his only family, yet sometimes he thought, or maybe hoped, that strangers in the street seemed to know him. Very strange strangers they were, too. A tiny man in a violet top hat bowed to him once, while out shopping with Aunt Petunia and Dudley. After asking Harry furiously if he knew the man, Aunt Petunia had rushed them out of the shop without buying anything. A wild-looking old woman dressed in all green had waved merrily at him once on a bus. A bald man in a very long purple coat had actually shaken his hand in the street the other day, and then walked away without a word. The weirdest thing about these people is the way they seemed to vanish the second Harry tried to take a second look. At school, Harry had no one. Everyone knew that Dudley's gang hated that odd Harry Potter in his baggy old clothes and broken glasses, and no one liked to disagree with Dudley's gang. Chapter 3. The Letters from No One. The escape of the Brazilian boa constrictor earned Harry his longest ever punishment. By the time he was allowed out of his cupboard again, The summer holidays had started, and Dudley had already broken his new cine camera, crashed his remote-control aeroplane, and, the first time on his racing bike, knocked down old Mrs. Figg as she crossed Pivot Drive on her crutches. Harry was glad school was over, but there was no escaping Dudley's gang, who visited the house every single day. Piers, Dennis, Malcolm, and Gordon were all big and stupid. But as Dudley was the biggest and stupidest of the lot, he was the leader. The rest of them were all quite happy to join Dudley's favourite sport, Harry hunting. This was why Harry spent as much time as possible out of the house, wandering around and thinking about the end of the holidays, where he could see a tiny ray of hope. When September came, he would be going off to secondary school, and for the first time in his life, he wouldn't be with Dudley. Dudley had a place at Uncle Vernon's old school, Smeltings. Piers Pocus was going there too. Harry, on the other hand, was going to Stonewall High, the local comprehensive. Dudley thought this was very funny.
"They stuff people's heads down their toilet first day at Stonewall," he told Harry. "Want to come upstairs and practice?"
"No thanks," said Harry. "The poor toilets never had anything as horrible as your head down it. It might make them sick." Then he ran, before Dudley could work out what he just said. One day in July, Aunt Petunia took Dudley to London to buy his Smeltings uniform, leaving Harry at Mrs. Figg's. Mrs. Figg wasn't as bad as usual. It turned out she'd broken her leg tripping over one of her cats, and she didn't seem quite as fond of them as before. She let Harry watch television and gave him a bit of chocolate cake that tasted as though she'd had it for several years. That evening, Dudley paraded around the living room for the family in his brand-new uniform. Smeltings boys wore maroon tailcoats, orange knickerbockers, and flat straw hats called boaters. They also carried knobbly sticks, used for hitting each other while the teachers weren't looking. This was supposed to be good training for later life. As he looked at Dudley in his new knickerbockers, Uncle Vernon said gruffly that this was the proudest moment of his life. Aunt Petunia burst into tears and said she couldn't believe it was her ickle diddlikins. He looked so handsome and grown up. Harry didn't trust himself to speak. He thought 2 of his ribs might already have cracked from trying not to laugh. There was a horrible smell in the kitchen the next morning when Harry went in for breakfast. It seemed to be coming from a large metal tub in the sink. He went to have a look. The tub was full of what looked like dirty rags swimming in grey water. "What's this?" he asked Aunt Petunia. Her lips tightened, as they always did, if he dared ask a question. "Your new school uniform," she said. Harry looked in the bowl again. "Oh," he said. "I didn't realize it had to be so wet." "Don't be stupid," snapped Aunt Petunia. "I'm dyeing some of Dudley's old things grey for you. It'll look just like everyone else's when I'm finished." Harry seriously doubted this, but thought it was best not to argue. He sat down at the table and tried not to think about how he was going to look on his first day at Stonewall High. Like he was wearing bits of old elephant skin, probably. Dudley and Uncle Vernon came in, both with wrinkled noses because of the smell of Harry's new uniform. Uncle Vernon opened his newspaper as usual, and Dudley banged his smelting stick, which he carried everywhere, on the table. They heard the click of the letterbox and flop of letters on the doormat. "Get the post, Dudley," said Uncle Vernon from behind his paper.
"Make Harry get it."
"Get the post, Harry." "Make Dudley get it." "Poke him with your smelting stick, Dudley." Harry dodged the smelting stick and went to get the post. 3 things lay on the doormat. A postcard from Uncle Vernon's sister Marge, who was holidaying on the Isle of Wight, a brown envelope that looked like a bill, and a letter for Harry. Harry picked it up and stared at it, his heart twanging like a giant elastic band. No one, ever, in his whole life, had written to him. Who would? He had no friends, no other relatives. He never belonged to the library, so he never even got rude notes asking for books back. Yet here it was, a letter, addressed so plainly there could be no mistake. Mr. H. Potter, The Cupboard Under the Stairs, 4 Pivot Drive, Little Winging, Surrey. The envelope was thick and heavy, made of yellowish parchment, and the address was written in emerald green ink. There was no stamp. Turning the envelope over, his hand trembling, Harry saw a purple wax seal bearing a coat of arms, a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a snake, surrounding a large letter H. "Hurry up, boy," shouted Uncle Vernon from the kitchen. "What are you doing, checking for letter bombs?" He chuckled at his own joke. Harry went back to the kitchen, still staring at his letter. He handed Uncle Vernon the bill and postcard, sat down, and slowly began to open the yellow envelope. Uncle Vernon ripped open the bill, snorted in disgust, and flipped over the postcard. "Margiselle," he informed Aunt Petunia. "It's a funny relk." "Dad," said Dudley suddenly. Dad, Harry's got something." Harry was on the point of unfolding his letter, which was written in the same heavy parchment as the envelope, when it was jerked sharply out of his hand by Uncle Vernon. "That's mine," said Harry, trying to snatch it back. "Who'd be writing to you?" sneered Uncle Vernon, shaking the letter open with one hand and glancing at it. His face went from red to green faster than a set of traffic lights. And it didn't stop there. Within seconds it was the greyish-white of old porridge. "Petunia!" he gasped. Dudley tried to grab the letter to read it, but Uncle Vernon held it high out of reach. Aunt Petunia took it cautiously and read the first line. For a moment it looked as though she might faint. She clutched her throat and made a choking noise. "Vernon! Oh, my goodness, Vernon!" They stared at each other, seeming to have forgotten that Harry and Dudley were still in the room. Dudley wasn't used to being ignored. He gave his father a sharp tap on the head with his smelting stick. "I want to read that letter," he said loudly. "I want to read it," said Harry furiously, "as it's mine." "Get out, both of you," croaked Uncle Vernon, stuffing the letter back inside its envelope. Harry didn't move. "I want my letter," he shouted. "Let me see it," demanded Dudley. "Out!" roared Uncle Vernon, and he took both Harry and Dudley by the scruffs of their necks and threw them out into the hall, slamming the kitchen door behind them. Harry and Dudley promptly had a furious but silent fight over who would listen at the keyhole. Dudley won, so Harry, his glasses dangling from one ear, lay flat on his stomach to listen at the crack between the door and the floor. "Vernon," Aunt Petunia was saying in a quivering voice, "look at the address. How could they possibly know where he sleeps? You don't think they're watching the house?" "Watching, spying, might be following us," muttered Uncle Vernon wildly. "But what should we do, Vernon? Should we write back? Tell them we don't want—" Harry could see Uncle Vernon's shiny black shoes pacing up and down the kitchen. "No," he said finally. "No, we'll ignore it. If they don't get an answer, yes, that's the best. We won't do anything. But I'm not having one in the house, Petunia. Didn't we swear when we took him in we'd stamp out this dangerous nonsense?" That evening, when he got back from work, Uncle Vernon did something he'd never done before. He visited Harry in his cupboard. "Where's my letter?" said Harry, the moment Uncle Vernon had squeezed through the door. "Who's writing to me?" "No one. It was addressed to you by mistake," said Uncle Vernon shortly. "I have burnt it." "It was not a mistake," said Harry angrily. "It had my cupboard on it." "Silence!" yelled Uncle Vernon, and a couple of spiders fell from the ceiling. He took a few breaths and forced his face into a smile, which looked quite painful. Yes, Harry, about this cupboard. Your aunt and I have been thinking you've really been getting a bit big for it. We think it would be nice if you moved into Dudley's second bedroom." "Why?" said Harry. "Don't ask questions," snapped his uncle. "Take this stuff upstairs now." The Dursleys' house had 4 bedrooms, one for Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia, one for visitors, usually Uncle Vernon's sister, Marge, one where Dudley slept, and one where Dudley kept all the toys and things that wouldn't fit into his first bedroom. It only took Harry one trip upstairs to move everything he owned from the cupboard to this room. He sat down on the bed and stared around him. Nearly everything in here was broken. The month-old cine camera was lying on top of a small, working tank Dudley had once driven over the next door's dog. In the corner was Dudley's first-ever television set, which he'd put a foot through when his favourite programme had been cancelled. There was a large bird cage which once held a parrot that Dudley had swapped at school for a real air rifle, which was up on a shelf with the end all bent because Dudley had sat on it. Other shelves were full of books. They were the only things in the room that looked as though they had never been touched. From downstairs came sound of Dudley bawling at his mother.
"I don't want him in there. I need that room. Make him get out."
Harry sighed and stretched out on the bed. Yesterday he'd have given up anything to be up here. Today he'd rather be back in the cupboard with that letter than up here without it. The next morning at breakfast everyone was rather quiet. Dudley was in shock. He'd screamed, whacked his father with his smelting stick, been sick on purpose, kicked his mother, and thrown his tortoise through the greenhouse roof, and he still didn't have his room back. Harry was thinking about this time yesterday, and bitterly wishing he'd opened the letter in the hall. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia kept looking at each other darkly. When the post arrived, Uncle Vernon, who seemed to be trying to be nice to Harry, made Dudley go get it, and they heard him banging things with his smelting stick all the way down the hall. Then he shouted,
"There's another one! Mr. H. Potter, the smallest bedroom, 4 Pivot Drive."
With a strangled cry, Uncle Vernon left from his seat and ran down the hall, Harry right behind him. Uncle Vernon had to wrestle Dudley to the ground to get the letter off him, which was made difficult by the fact that Harry had grabbed Uncle Vernon round the neck from behind. After a minute of confused fighting, in which everyone got hit a lot by the smelting stick, Uncle Vernon straightened up, gasping for breath with Harry's letter clutched in his hand. "Go to your cupboard. I'm in your bedroom," he wheezed at Harry. "Dudley, just go." Harry walked round and round his new room. Everyone knew he had moved out of the cupboard, and they seemed to know he hadn't received the first letter. Surely that meant they'll try again, and this time they'd made sure they didn't fail. He had a plan. The repaired alarm clock rang at 6 o'clock the next morning. Harry turned it off quickly and dressed silently. He mustn't wake the Dursleys. He stole downstairs without turning on any of the lights. He was going to wait for the postman on the corner of Pivot Drive and get his letters for number 4 first. His heart hammered as he crept across the dark hall across the front door. "Yeah!" Harry leapt into the air. He'd trodden on something large and squishy on the doormat. Something alive. Lights clicked on upstairs, and to his horror, Harry realized that the big squishy something had been his uncle's face. Uncle Vernon had been lying on the foot of the front door in a sleeping bag, clearly making sure that Harry didn't do exactly what he'd been trying to do. He shouted at Harry for about half an hour, and been told to go and make a cup of tea. Harry shuffled miserably off to the kitchen. By the time he got back, the post had arrived, right into Uncle Vernon's lap. Harry could see 3 letters addressed in green ink. "I want—" he began, but Uncle Vernon was tearing the letters into pieces before his eyes. Uncle Vernon didn't go to work that day. He stayed at home and nailed up the letterbox. "See?" he explained to Aunt Petunia through a mouthful of nails. "If they can't deliver them, they'll just give up." "I'm not sure that'll work, Vernon." "Oh, these people minds work in strange ways, Petunia. They're not like you and me," said Uncle Vernon, trying to knock a nail in with a piece of fruitcake Aunt Petunia had just brought him. On Friday, no fewer than 12 letters arrived for Harry. As they couldn't go through the letterbox, they had been pushed under the door, slotted through the sides, and even forced through the small window in the downstairs toilet. Uncle Vernon stayed at home again. After burning all the letters, he got out a hammer and nails and boarded up all the cracks around the front and back doors so no one could go out. He hummed "Tiptoe through the tulips" as he worked, and jumped at small noises. On Saturday, things began to get out of hand. 24 letters to Harry found their way into the house. Rolled up and hidden inside each of the 24 eggs that found their very confused milkman had handed Aunt Petunia through the living-room window, while Uncle Vernon made furious telephone calls to the post office and the dairy trying to find someone to complain to. Aunt Petunia shredded the letters in her food mixer. "Who on earth wants to talk to you this badly?" Dudley asked Harry in amazement. On Sunday morning, Uncle Vernon sat down at the breakfast table, looking tired and rather ill, but happy. "No post on Sundays," he reminded them happily, as he spread marmalade onto his newspapers. "No damn letters today." Something came whizzing down the kitchen chimney as he spoke, and caught him sharply on the back of the head. Next moment 30 or 40 letters came pelting out of the fireplace like bullets. The Dursleys ducked, but Harry leapt into the air, trying to catch one. "Out! Out!" Uncle Vernon seized Harry around the waist and threw him out into the hall. When Aunt Petunia and Dudley had run out with their arms over their faces, Uncle Vernon slammed the door shut. They could hear the letters still streaming into the room, bouncing off the walls and floor. "That does it," said Uncle Vernon, trying to speak calmly, but pulling great tufts out of his moustache at the same time. "I want you all back here in 5 minutes, ready to leave. We're going away. Just pack some clothes. No arguments." He looked so dangerous with half his moustache missing that no one dared argue. 10 minutes later they had wrenched their way through the boarded-up doors and were in the car, speeding towards the motorway. Dudley was sniffing in the back seat. His father had hit him round the head for holding them up while he tried to pack his television, video, and computer in his sports bag. They drove, and they drove. Even Aunt Petunia didn't dare ask where they were going. Every now and then, Uncle Vernon would take a sharp turning and drive in the opposite direction for a while. "Shake 'em off," he would mutter whenever he did this. They didn't stop to eat or drink all day. By nightfall, Dudley was howling. He'd never had such a bad day in his life. He was hungry, he'd missed 5 television programs he'd wanted to see, and he'd never gone for so long without blowing up an alien on his computer. Uncle Vernon stopped at last outside a gloomy-looking hotel on the outskirts of a big city. Dudley and Harry shared a room with twin beds and damp, musty sheets. Dudley snored, but Harry stayed awake, sitting on the windowsill, staring down at the lights of passing cars and wondering. They ate stale cornflakes and cold tinned tomatoes on toast for breakfast the next day. They had just finished when the owner of the hotel came over to their table.
"Excuse me, but is one of you Mr. H. Potter? Only got about 100 of these at the front desk."
She held up a letter so they could read the green ink address. Mr. H. Potter, Room 17, Railview Hotel, Cokeworth. Harry made a grab for the letter, but Uncle Vernon knocked his hand out of the way. The woman stared. "I'll take him," said Uncle Vernon, standing up quickly and following her from the dining room.
"Wouldn't it be better to just go home, dear?"
said Aunt Petunia, suggesting timidly hours later. But Uncle Vernon didn't seem to hear her. Exactly what he was looking for, none of them knew. He drove them into the middle of the forest, got out, looked around, shook his head, got back into the car, and off they went again. The same thing happened in the middle of the ploughed field, halfway across a suspension bridge, and at the top of a multi-story car park.
"Daddy's gone mad, hasn't he?"
Dudley asked Aunt Petunia late that afternoon. Uncle Vernon had parked at the coast, locked them all inside the car, and disappeared. It started to rain. Giant drops beat on the roof of the car. Dudley snivelled.
It's Monday,"
he told his mother.
"The Great Humberto's on tonight. I want to stay somewhere with a television."
Monday. This reminded Harry of something. If it was Monday, and you could usually count on Dudley to know the days of the week because of television, then tomorrow, Tuesday, was Harry's 11th birthday. Of course, his birthdays were never exactly fun. Last year, the Dursleys had given him a coat hanger and a pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks. Still, you weren't 11 every day. Uncle Vernon was back, and he was smiling. He was also carrying a long, thin package, and didn't answer Aunt Petunia when she asked what he'd bought. "Found the perfect place," he said. "Come on, everyone out." It was very cold outside the car. Uncle Vernon was pointing at what looked like a large rock, way out to sea. Perched on top of the rock was the most miserable shack you could imagine. One thing was certain, there was no television in there. "Storm forecast for tonight," said Uncle Vernon, gleefully clapping his hands together. "And this gentleman's kindly agreed to lend us his boat." A toothless old man came ambling up to them, pointing with a rather wicked grin at an old rolling boat bobbing in the iron-grey water below them. "I've already got us some rations," said Uncle Vernon. "So all aboard." It was freezing in the boat. Icy sea spray and rain crept down their necks, and a chilly wind whipped their faces. After what seemed like hours, they reached the rock, where Uncle Vernon, slipped and sliding, led the way to the broken-down house. The inside was horrible. It smelled strongly of seaweed. The wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden walls, and the fireplace was damp and empty. There were only 2 rooms. Uncle Vernon's rations turned out to be a packet of crisps each and 4 bananas. He tried to start a fire, but the empty crisp packets just smoked and shriveled up. "Could do with some of those letters now, eh?" he said cheerfully. He was in a very good mood. Obviously, he thought no one stood a chance of reaching them here in a storm to deliver post. Harry privately agreed, though the thought didn't cheer him up at all. As night fell, the promised storm blew in around them. Spray from the high waves splattered on the walls of the hut, and a fierce wind rattled the filthy windows. Aunt Petunia found a few mouldy blankets in the second room, and made up a bed for Dudley on the moth-eaten sofa. She and Uncle Vernon went off to the lumpy bed next door, and Harry was left to find the softest bit of floor he could find and curl up under the thinnest, most raggiest blanket. The storm raged more and more furiously as the night went on. Harry couldn't sleep. He shivered and turned over, trying to get comfortable, his stomach rumbling with hunger. Dudley's snores were drowned by the low rolls of thunder that started near midnight. The lighted dial of Dudley's watch, which was dangling over the edge of the sofa on his fat wrist, told Harry he'd be 11 in 10 minutes' time. He lay and watched his birthday tick nearer, wondering if the Dursleys would ever remember at all, wondering where the letter-writer was now. 5 minutes to go. Harry heard something creak outside. He hoped the roof wasn't going to fall in, although he might be warmer if it did. 4 minutes to go. Maybe their house in Privet Drive would be so full of letters when they got back that he'd be able to steal one somehow. 3 minutes to go. Was that the sea slapping hard on the rock like that? And 2 minutes to go. What was that funny crunching noise? Was the rock crumbling into the sea? 1 minute to go, and he'd be 11. 30 seconds. 20. 10. 9. Maybe he'd wake Dudley up just to annoy him. 3, 2, 1. Boom! The whole shack shivered, and Harry sat bolt upright, staring at the door. Someone was outside, knocking to come in. Chapter 4. The Keeper of the Keys. Boom! They knocked again. Dudley jerked awake.
"Where's the cannon?"
he said stupidly. There was a crash from behind them, and Uncle Vernon came skidding into the room. He was holding a rifle in his hands. Now they knew what had been in the long, thin package he had brought with them. "Who's there?" he shouted. "I warn you, I'm armed." There was a pause. Then, smash! The door was hit with such force that it swung clean off its hinges, and with a deafening crash, landed flat on the floor. A giant man was standing in the doorway. His face was almost completely hidden by a long, shaggy mane of hair and a wild, tangled beard, but you could make out his eyes, glinting like black beetles under all the hair. The giant squeezed his way into the hut, stooping so that his head just brushed the ceiling. He bent down, picked up the door, and fitted it easily back into its frame. The noise of the storm outside dropped a little. He turned to look at them all. "Couldn't make us a cup of tea, could you? Not been an easy journey." He strode over the sofa where Dudley was frozen with fear. "Budge up, you great lump," said the stranger. Dudley squeaked and ran to hide behind his mother, who was crouching terrified behind Uncle Vernon.
"And here's Harry,"
said the giant. Harry looked up into the fierce, wild, shadowy face and saw that the beetle eyes were cracked into a smile.
"Last time I saw you, you were only a baby," said the giant. "Yeah, you look a lot like your dad, but you got your mum's eyes."
Uncle Vernon made a funny rasping noise.
I demand that you leave at once, sir," he said. "You are breaking and entering." "Ah, shut up, Dursley, you great prune,"
said the giant. He reached over the back of the sofa, jerked the gun out of Uncle Vernon's hands, bent it into a knot as easily as it had been made of rubber, and then threw it into the corner of the room. Uncle Vernon made another funny noise, like a mouse being trodden on.
"Anyway, Harry,"
said the giant, turning his back on the Dursleys,
"have a very happy birthday to ya. Got something for you here. I might have sat on it at some point, but it'll taste all right."
From an inside pocket on his black overcoat, he pulled a slightly squished box. Harry opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a large, sticky chocolate cake with Happy Birthday Harry written on it in green icing. Harry looked at the giant. He meant to say thank you, but the words got lost on the way to his mouth, and what he said was, "Who are you?" The giant chuckled.
"True, I haven't introduced myself. Rubus Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts."
He held out an enormous hand and shook Harry's whole arm.
"What about that tea then, eh?"
he said, rubbing his hands together.
"I'd not say no to something stronger if you got it, mind."
His eyes fell on the empty grate with the shriveled crisp packets in it, and he snorted. He bent down over the fireplace. They couldn't see what he was doing, but when he drew back a second later, there was a roaring fire there. It filled the whole damp hut with flickering light, and Harry felt the warmth wash over him as though he'd been sunk into a hot bath. The giant sat down on the sofa, which sagged under his weight, and began taking all sorts of things out of the pockets of his coat. A copper kettle, a squashy packet of sausages, a porker teapot, several chipped mugs, and a bottle of some amber liquid, which he took a swig from before starting to make tea. Soon the hut was full of the sound and smell of sizzling sausage. Nobody said a thing while the giant was working, but as he slid the first fat, juicy, slightly burnt sausages from the porker, Dudley fidgeted a little. Uncle Vernon said sharply, "Don't touch anything he gives you, Dudley." The giant chuckled darkly.
"Your great puddin' of a son don't need fattening any more. Dursley, don't worry."
He passed the sausages over to Harry, who was so hungry he had never tasted anything so wonderful. But he still couldn't take his eyes off the giant. Finally, as nobody seemed to explain anything, he said, "I'm sorry, but I still don't really know who you are." The giant took a gulp of tea and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand.
"Call me Hagrid," he said. "Everyone does. And like I told you, I'm the keeper of keys at Hogwarts. Yeah, know about Hogwarts, of course."
No," said Harry. Hagrid looked shocked. "Sorry," Harry said quickly.
"Sorry?"
barked Hagrid, turning to stare at the Dursleys, who shrank back into the shadows.
"It's them who should be sorry. I knew you weren't getting the letters, but I never thought you wouldn't know about Hogwarts for crying out loud. Did you never wonder where all your parents learnt it all?"
"Learnt all what?" said Harry.
"All what?"
Hagrid thundered.
"Now wait just 1 second."
He had leapt to his feet. In his anger he seemed to fill the whole hut. The Dursleys were cowering against the wall.
"Do you mean to tell me," he growled at the Dursleys, "that this boy knows nothing about anything?"
Harry thought that this was going a bit far. He had been to school, after all, and his marks weren't bad. "I know some things," he said. "I can, do maths and stuff." But Hagrid simply waved his hands and said,
"About our world. I mean, your world, my world, your parents' world."
"What world?" Hagrid looked as if he was about to explode.
"Dursley!"
he boomed. Uncle Vernon, who had gone very pale, whispered something that sounded like "Mibble." Hagrid stared wildly at Harry.
"But you must know something about your mum and dad," he said. "I mean, they're famous. You're famous."
"What? My mum and dad weren't famous? Were they?"
"You don't know?"
You don't know. Hagrid ran his fingers through his hair, fixing Harry with a bewildered stare. You don't know what you are, he said finally. Uncle Vernon suddenly found his voice. Stop, he said. Stop right there, sir. I forbid you to tell the boy anything. A braver man than Vernon Dursley would have quailed under the furious look Hagrid had gave him. When Hagrid spoke, his every syllable trembled with rage. You never told him. Never told him what was in the letter Dumbledore left for him. I was there. I saw Dumbledore leave it, Dursley, and you've kept it from him all these years. Kept what from me? Said Harry eagerly. Stop! I forbid you! Yelled Uncle Vernon in panic. Aunt Petunia gave a gasp of horror. Go ball your heads, both of you, said Hagrid. Harry, you're a wizard. There was a silence inside the hut. Only the sea and the whistling wind could be heard. I'm a what? Gasped Harry. A wizard, of course, said Harry, sitting back down on the sofa, which groaned and sank even lower. And a thumping good 'un, I'd say, once you've trained up a bit, with a mum and dad like yours. What else could you be? And I reckon it's about time you read your letter. Harry stretched out his hand at last to take the yellowish envelope, addressed in emerald green to Mr. H. Potter, the floor, hut on the rock, the sea. He pulled out the letter and read, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Headmaster Albus Dumbledore, Order of Merlin First Class Grand Sorceress, Chief Warlock Supreme Mugwump, International Confederation of Wizards. Dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you you have a place at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and equipment. Term begins 1st September. We await your owl by no later than 31st July. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. Questions exploded inside Harry's head like fireworks, and he couldn't decide which to ask first. After a few minutes he stammered, What does this mean? They await my owl? Gallopin' Gorgons, that reminds me, said Harry, clapping a hand to his forehead with enough force to knock over a cart horse. And from yet another pocket inside his overcoat, he pulled an owl. A real, live, rather ruffled-looking owl, a long quill and a roll of parchment. With his tongue between his teeth, he scribbled a note which Harry could read upside down. Dear Mr. Dumbledore, given Harry his letter, taking him to buy things tomorrow. Weather's horrible, hope you're well. Hagrid. Hagrid rolled up the note, gave it to the owl, which clasped it in its beak, went to the door and threw the owl into the storm. Then he came back and sat down as though this was as normal as talking on the telephone. Harry realized his mouth was open, and closed it quickly. Right, where was I? Said Hagrid. But at that moment, Uncle Vernon, still ashen-faced but looking very angry, moved into the firelight. He's not going, he said. Hagrid grunted. I'd like to see a great muggle like you stop him, he said. A what? Said Harry, interested. A muggle, said Hagrid. That's what we call non-magic folk like them. And it's bad luck you grew up with a family of the biggest muggles I ever laid my eyes on. We swore when we took him in we'd put a stop to that rubbish, said Uncle Vernon. Swore we'd stamp it out of him. Wizard indeed. You knew? Said Harry. You knew I'm a wizard? Knew? Shrieked Aunt Petunia suddenly. Knew? Of course we knew. How could you not be, my dratted sister being what she was? Oh, she got her letter just like that and disappeared off to that school and came home every holiday with her pockets full of frog spawn, turning teacups into rats. I was the only one who saw her for what she was, a freak. But for my mother and father, oh no, it was Lily this and Lily that. They were proud of having a witch in the family. She stopped to draw a deep breath and went ranting on. It seemed she was wanting to say this for years. Then she met that Potter at school, and they left and got married, and they had you, and of course I knew you'd just be the same, just as strange, just as abnormal. And then, if you please, she'd went and got herself blown up, and we got landed with you. Harry had gone very white. As soon as he found his voice, he said, Blown up? You told me they died in a car crash.
Car crash?
Roared Hagrid, jumping up so angrily that the Dursleys scuttled back into their corner.
How could a car crash kill Lily and James Potter? It's an outrage, a scandal. Harry Potter not knowing his own story when every kid in our world knows his name.
But why? What happened? Harry asked urgently. The anger faded from Hagrid's face. He looked suddenly anxious.
I never expected this,
he said in a low, worried voice.
I had no idea when Dumbledore told me there'd be a trouble getting hold of you. How much you didn't know. Oh, Harry, I don't know if I'm the right person to tell you, but someone's oughta. Yep, can't go up to Hogwarts not knowing.
He threw a dirty look at the Dursleys.
Well, it's best to know as much as I can tell you. Mind, I can't tell you everything. It's a great mystery, parts of it.
He sat down, stared into the fire for a few seconds, and then said,
It begins, I suppose, with a person called... But it's incredible to know you don't know his name. Everyone in our world knows.
Who?
Well, I don't like saying the name if I can't help it. No one does.
Why not?
Gulp and gargoyles, Harry. People are scared. Blimey, this is difficult. See, there was this wizard who went bad. As bad as you could go. Worse than worse. His name was...
Hagrid gulped, but no words came out. Could you write it down? Harry suggested.
Nah, can't spell it. All right. Voldemort.
Hagrid shuddered.
Don't make me say his name again. Anyway, this wizard, about 20 years ago now, started looking for followers. Got 'em too. Some were afraid. Some just wanted a bit of his power. 'Cause he was getting himself power all right. Dark days, Harry. Didn't know who to trust. Didn't dare get friendly with the strange wizards or witches. Terrible things happened. He was taken over. Course, some stood up to him, and he killed 'em. Horribly. One of the safest places left was Hogwarts. Reckon Dumbledore's the only one you-know-who was afraid of. Didn't dare try taking the schools. Not just then, anyway. Now, your mum and dad were good a witch and wizard as I ever knew. Head boy and girl in Hogwarts in their day. Suppose the mystery of why you-know-who never tried to get 'em on his side before. Probably knew they were too close to Dumbledore to want anything to do with the dark side. Maybe he thought he could persuade him. Maybe he thought he wanted him out of the way. All anyone knows is he turned up in the village where you was all living on Halloween 10 years ago. You were just a year old. He came to your house and...
Hagrid suddenly pulled out a very dirty spotted handkerchief and blew his nose like the sound of a foghorn.
Sorry, he said, but it's that sad. Your mum and dad, nicer people you couldn't find. Anyway, you-know-who killed him. And then, and this is the real mystery of the thing, he tried to kill you too. Wanted to make a clean job of it, I suppose. Or maybe you just liked killing by then. But he couldn't do it. Never wondered how you got that mark on your forehead. That was no ordinary cut. That's what you get when a powerful, evil curse touches you. Took care of your mum and dad and your house, even. But it didn't work on you. And that's why you're famous, Harry. No one ever lived after he decided to kill him. No one except you. And he'd killed some of the best witches and wizards of the age. The McKinnons, the Bones, the Prowetts, and you were only a baby, and you lived.
Something very painful was going on in Harry's mind. As Hagrid's story came to a close, he saw again the blinding flash of green light, more clearly than he had ever remembered it before, and he remembered something else. For the first time in his life, a high, cold, cruel laugh. Hagrid was watching him sadly.
Took you from the ruined house myself, on Dumbledore's orders. brought you to this lot?" "Load of old tosh,"
said Uncle Vernon. Harry jumped. He had almost forgotten that the Dursleys were there. Uncle Vernon certainly seemed to have got back his courage. He was glaring at Hagrid, and his fists were clenched. "Now you listen here, boy," he snarled. "I accept there's something strange about you. Probably nothing a good beating wouldn't have cured. And as for all this about your parents, well, they were weirdos. No denying it. The world's better off without them, in my opinion. Ask for all they got. Getting mixed up with these wizarding types. Just as I expected. Always knew they'd be coming to a sticky end." But at that moment Hagrid leapt from the sofa and drew a battered pink umbrella from inside his coat, pointed this on Uncle Vernon like a sword, and said, "I'm warning you, one more word." In danger of being speared on the end of the umbrella by a bearded giant, Uncle Vernon's courage failed again. He flattened himself against the wall and fell silent. "That's better," said Hagrid, breathing heavily and sitting back down on the sofa, which by this time sagged right down to the floor. Harry, meanwhile, still had questions to ask. Hundreds of them. "But what happened to I'm sorry, I mean, you know who?"
"Good question, Harry. Disappeared, vanished. Seemed like he tried to kill you. Makes you even more famous. That's the biggest mystery, see? He was getting more and more powerful. Why'd he go? Some say he died. Codswallop, in my opinion. Dunno if he had enough human left in him to die. Some say he's still out there, biding his time like, but I don't believe it. People were on his side came back to ours. Some of 'em came out of like trances. Don't reckon they could have done if he were coming back. Most of us reckon he's still out there somewhere, but lost his powers, too weak to carry on. 'Cause something about you finished him, Harry. There was something going on that night he hadn't counted on. I don't know what it was. No one does. But something about you stumped him all right."
Hagrid looked at Harry, with the warmth and respect blazing in his eyes. But Harry, instead of feeling pleased and proud, felt quite sure there'd been a horrible mistake. A wizard? Him? How could he possibly be? He'd spent his life being clouted by Dudley and bullied by Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon. If he really was a wizard, why hadn't they been turned into warty toads every time they tried to lock him in the cupboard? If he once defeated the greatest sorcerer in the world, how come Dudley had always been able to kick him around like a football? "Hagrid," he said quietly, I think you've made a mistake. I don't think I can be a wizard." To his surprise, Hagrid chuckled.
"Ha ha, not a wizard, eh? Never made things happen when you were scared or angry."
Harry looked into the fire. Now he came to think about it. Every odd thing that had ever made his aunt and uncle furious with him had happened when he, Harry, had been upset or angry. Chased by Dudley's gang, he had somehow found himself out of their reach. Dreading going to school with that ridiculous haircut, he'd managed to grow it back. And the very last time Dudley had hit him, hadn't he got his revenge without even realizing he'd done it? Hadn't he set a boa constrictor on him? Harry looked back at Hagrid, smiling, and saw that Hagrid was positively beaming at him.
"See," said Hagrid. "Harry Potter, not a wizard. You wait. You'll be right famous at Hogwarts."
But Uncle Vernon wasn't going to give in without a fight. "Haven't I told you he's not going? He's going to Stonewall High, and I'll be grateful for it. I've read those letters, and he needs all sorts of rubbish, spell books and wands and—"
"If he wants to go, a great muggle like you won't stop him," growled Hagrid. "Stop Lily and James Potter's son going to Hogwarts? You're mad. His name's been down ever since he was born. He's off to the finest school of witchcraft and wizardry in the world. 7 years there, and he won't know himself. He'll be with the youngsters of his own sort for a change. And he'll be under the greatest headmaster Hogwarts ever had, Albus Dumbledore."
"I'm not paying for some crackpot old fool to teach you magic tricks," yelled Uncle Vernon. But he had finally gone too far. Hagrid seized his umbrella and whirled it over his head.
"Never," he thundered, "insult Albus Dumbledore in front of me."
He brought the umbrella swishing down through the air to point at Dudley. There was a flash of violet light, a sound like a firecracker, a sharp squeal, and the next second Dudley was dancing on the spot, with his hands clasped over his fat bottom, howling in pain. When he turned back on them, Harry saw a curly pig's tail poking through the hole in his trousers. Uncle Vernon roared, pulling Aunt Petunia and Dudley into the other room. He cast one terrified look at Hagrid, and slammed the door shut behind them. Hagrid looked down at his umbrella and stroked his beard. "Shouldn't have lost me temper," he said ruefully. "But it didn't work anyway. Meant to turn him into a pig. But I suppose he was so much like a pig anyway, there wasn't much left to do." He cast a sideways look at Harry under his bushy eyebrows. "Be careful you didn't mention that to anyone at Hogwarts," he said. "I'm, not supposed to do magic, strictly speaking. I was allowed to, do a bit to follow you and get your letters to you and stuff. One of the reasons I was so keen to take the job."
"Why aren't you supposed to do magic?" asked Harry.
"Oh, well, I was at Hogwarts myself, but I got expelled. To tell you the truth, in me 3rd year they snapped me wand in half and everything. But Dumbledore let me stay on as gameskeeper. Great man, Dumbledore."
"Why were you expelled?"
"It's getting late, and we've got lots to do tomorrow," said Hagrid loudly. "Gotta get up to town, get all your books and that."
He took off his thick black coat and threw it to Harry.
"You can kip under that," he said. "Don't mind if it wriggles a bit. I think I got a couple of dormice in one of the pockets."
Chapter 5. Diagon Alley.
Harry woke early the next morning. Although he could tell it was daylight, he kept his eyes shut tight. "It was a dream," he told himself firmly. "I dreamed a giant called Hagrid came to tell me I was going to a school for wizards. When I opened my eyes, I'll be home in my cupboard."
There was suddenly a loud tapping noise.
"And there's Aunt Petunia knocking on the door,"
Harry thought, his heart sinking, but he still didn't open his eyes. It had been such a good dream. Tap, tap, tap.
"All right," Harry mumbled. "I'm getting up."
He sat up, and Hagrid's heavy coat fell on him. The hut was full of sunlight. The storm was over. Hagrid himself was asleep on the collapsed sofa, and there was an owl rapping its claw on the window, a newspaper held in its beak. Harry scrambled to his feet. So happy he felt, as though a large balloon was swelling inside him. He went straight to the window and jerked it open. The owl swooped in and dropped the newspaper on top of Hagrid, who didn't wake up. The owl then fluttered onto the floor and began to attack Hagrid's coat.
"Don't do that!"
Harry tried to wave the owl out of the way, but it snapped its fierce beak at him and carried on savaging the coat.
"Hagrid," said Harry loudly, "there's an owl."
"Pay him,"
Hagrid grunted into the sofa.
"What?"
"He wants paying for delivering the paper. Look in the pockets."
Hagrid's coat seemed to be made of nothing but pockets. Bunches of keys, slug pellets, balls of string, mint humbugs, tea bags. Finally, Harry pulled out a handful of strange-looking coins.
"Give him 5 nuts,"
said Hagrid sleepily.
"Nuts? The little bronze ones."
Harry counted out 5 little bronze coins, and the owl held out its leg so that it could put the money into the small leather pouch tied to it. It flew off through the window. Hagrid yawned loudly, sat up and stretched.
"Best be off, Harry. Lots to do today. Gotta get up to London and buy all this stuff for school."
Harry was turning over the wizard coins and looking at them. He had just bought something which made him feel as though the happy balloon inside him had got a puncture.
Hagrid,"
said Hagrid, who was pulling on his huge boots.
"I haven't got any money, and you heard Uncle Vernon last night. He won't pay for me to go and learn magic."
"Don't worry about that,"
said Hagrid, standing up and stretching his head.
"Do you think your parents didn't leave you anything?"
"But if their house was destroyed—"
"They didn't keep the gold in the house, boy. First up for us is Gringotts, Wizard's Bank. Have a sausage. They're not bad cold, and I wouldn't say no to a bit of birthday cake neither."
"Wizards have banks?"
"Just the one, Gringotts, run by goblins."
Harry dropped the bit of sausage he was holding.
"Goblins?"
"Yep, so you'd be mad to try and rob it, I can tell you that."
Never mess with goblins, Harry. Gringotts is the safest place in the world if you want anything to keep safe. Except maybe Hogwarts. As a matter of fact, I got to visit Gringotts anyway for Dumbledore. Hogwarts business.
Hagrid drew himself up proudly.
He usually gets me to do the important stuff for him. Fetching you, getting things from Gringotts. Knows he can trust me, say. Got everything? Come on then.
Harry followed Hagrid out onto the rock. The sky was quite clear now, and the sea gleamed on the sunlight. The boat Uncle Vernon had hired was still there, with a lot of water in the bottom after the storm. "How did you get here?" Harry asked, looking around for another boat.
Flew.
"Flew?"
Yep, but we'll go back in this. Not supposed to use magic, now I've got ya.
They settled down in the boat, Harry still staring at Hagrid, trying to imagine him flying.
Seems a shame to row, though,
said Hagrid, giving Harry another one of his sideways looks.
If I were to, speed things up a bit, would you mind not mentioning it, Hogwarts?
"Of course not," said Harry, eager to see some more magic. Hagrid pulled out the pink umbrella, tapped it twice on the side of the boat, and they sped off towards land. "Why would you be mad to try and rob Gringotts?" Harry asked.
Spells, enchantments,
unfolding his newspaper as he spoke.
They say there's dragons guarding the high-security vaults. And then you gotta find your way. Gringotts is 100 miles under London, you see. Deep underground. You'd die of hunger trying to get out, even if you did manage to get your hands on summit.
Harry sat and thought about this while Hagrid read the newspaper, the Daily Prophet. Harry had learned from Uncle Vernon that people liked to be left alone while they did this. But it was very difficult. He'd never had so many questions in his life.
Ministry of Magic messing things up as usual,
Hagrid muttered, turning the page. "There's a Ministry of Magic?" Harry asked, before he could stop himself.
"Course,"
said Hagrid.
"They wanted Dumbledore for minister, of course, but he'd never leave Hogwarts. So old Cornelius Fudge got the job. Bungler if ever there was one. So he pelts Dumbledore with owls every morning, asking for advice."
"But what does a Ministry of Magic do?"
"Well, their main job is to keep from all the muggles that there's still witches and wizards up in the country."
"Why?"
"Why? Blimey, Harry. Everyone will be wanting magic solutions to their problems. Not we're best left alone."
At this moment, the boat bumped gently into the harbour wall. Hagrid folded up his newspaper and they clambered up the stone steps onto the street. Passers-by stared a lot at Hagrid as they walked through the little town to the station. Harry couldn't blame them. Not only was Hagrid twice as tall as everyone else, but he kept pointing at perfectly ordinary things like parking meters and saying loudly,
"See that, Harry? Things these muggles dream up, eh?"
"Hagrid," said Harry, panting a bit as he ran up to them, "did you say there were dragons at Gringotts?"
"Well, so they say,"
said Hagrid.
"Crikey, I'd like a dragon."
"You'd like one?"
"Wanted one ever since I was a kid. Here we go."
They had reached the station. There was a train to London in 5 minutes' time. Hagrid, who didn't understand muggle money, as he called it, gave the notes to Harry so he could buy their tickets. People stared more than ever on the train. Hagrid took up 2 seats and sat knitting what looked like a canary yellow circus tent.
"Still got your letter, Harry?"
he asked as he counted stitches. Harry took the parchment envelope out of his pocket.
"Good,"
said Hagrid.
"There's a list there of everything I need."
Harry unfolded a second piece of paper he hadn't noticed the night before, and read, "Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Uniform. First-year students will require 1. 3 sets of plain work robes, black. 2. 1 plain pointed hat, black for day wear. 3. 1 pair of protective gloves, dragon hide or similar. 4. 1 winter cloak, black silver fastenings. Please note that all pupils' clothes should carry name tags. Set books. All students should have a copy of each of the following. The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1, by Miranda Goshank. A History of Magic, by Bathilda Bagshot. Magical Theory, by Adelbert Waffling. A Beginner's Guide to Transformation, by Emmerich Switch. 1000 Magical Herbs, by Philida Spore. Magical Draughts and Potions by Arsonist Jigger. Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them by Newt Salamander. The Dark Forces. A Guide to Protection by Quentin Trimble. Other equipment. 1 wand, 1 cauldron, pewter, standard size 2, 1 set glass or crystal phials, 1 telescope, 1 set brass scales. Students may also bring an owl, or a cat, or a toad. Parents are reminded that the first years are not allowed their own broomsticks. "Can we buy all this in London?" Harry wondered aloud.
"If you know where to go,"
said Hagrid. Harry had never been to London before, although Hagrid seemed to know where he was going. He was obviously not used to getting there in an ordinary way. Although Hagrid seemed to know where he was going, he was obviously not used to getting there in an ordinary way. He got stuck in the ticket barrier on the Underground and complained loudly that the seats were too small and the trains too slow.
"I don't know how muggles manage without magic,"
he said, as they climbed a broken-down escalator which led them to a bustling road lined with shops. Hagrid was so huge that he parted the crowd easily. All Harry had to do was step close behind him. They passed bookshops and music stores, hamburger bars and cinemas, but nowhere that looked as if it could sell you a magic wand. This was just an ordinary street, full of ordinary people. Could there really be piles of wizard gold buried miles beneath them? Were there really shops that sold spell books and broomsticks? Might this not be some huge joke of the Dursleys had cooked up? If Harry hadn't known that the Dursleys had no sense of humour, he might have thought so. Yet somehow, even though everything Hagrid had told him so far was unbelievable, Harry couldn't help trusting him.
"This is it,"
said Hagrid, coming to a halt.
"The Leaky Cauldron. It's a famous place."
It was a tiny, grubby-looking pub. If Hagrid hadn't pointed it out, Harry wouldn't have noticed it was there. The people hurrying by didn't glance at it. Their eyes slid from the big bookshop on one side to the record shop on the other, as if they couldn't see the Leaky Cauldron at all. In fact, Harry had the most peculiar feeling that only he and Hagrid could see it. Before he could mention this, Hagrid had steered him inside. For a famous place, it was very dark and shabby. A few old women were sitting in the corner, drinking tiny glasses of sherry. One of them was smoking a long pipe. A little man in a top hat was talking to the old barman, who was quite bald and looking like a gummy walnut. The low buzz of chatter stopped when they walked in. Everyone seemed to know Hagrid. They waved and smiled at him, and the barman reached for a glass, saying,
"Usual, Hagrid?" "Can't, Tom. I'm going on Hogwarts business," said Hagrid, clapping his great hand on Harry's shoulder and making Harry's knees buckle.
"Good Lord," said the barman, peering at Harry. "Can it be?" The Leaky Cauldron had suddenly gone completely still and silent.
"Bless my soul,"
whispered the old barman.
"Harry Potter! What an honour."
He hurried back from behind the bar, rushed towards Harry, and squeezed his hand, tears in his eyes.
"Welcome back, Mr. Potter. Welcome back."
Harry didn't know what to say. Everyone was looking at him. The old woman with the pipe was puffing on it without realizing it had gone out. Hagrid was beaming. Then there was a scraping of chairs, and the next moment Harry found himself shaking hands with everyone in the Leaky Cauldron.
"Doris Crookford, Mr. Potter, I can't believe I'm meeting you at last."
"So proud, Mr. Potter, just so proud."
"Delighted, Mr. Potter, I can't tell you. Dingle's the name, Diddless Dingle."
"I've seen you before," said Harry, as Diddless Dingle's top hat fell off in excitement. "You bowed to me once in the shop."
"He remembers,"
cried Diddless Dingle, looking around everyone. "Did you hear that? He remembers me." Harry shook hands again and again. Doris Crookford kept coming back for more. A pale young man made his way forward very nervously. One of his eyes was twitching.
"Professor Quirrell,"
said Hagrid.
"Harry, Professor Quirrell will be one of your teachers at Hogwarts."
"Potter," stammered Professor Quirrell, grasping Harry's hand.
"Can't tell you how
pleased I am to meet you." "What sort of magic do you teach, Professor Quirrell?"
Defense against the dark arts,"
muttered Professor Quirrell, as though he'd rather not talk about it.
Not that you need it, Potter." He laughed nervously. "You'll be getting all your equipment, I suppose. I've got to pick up a new book on vampires myself." He looked terrified at the very thought. But the others wouldn't let Professor Quirrell keep Harry to himself. It took almost 10 minutes to get away from them all. At last Hagrid managed to make himself heard over the babble. "Must get on. Lots to buy. Come on, Harry." Doris Crookford shook Harry's hand one last time, and Hagrid led them through the bar and out into the small walled courtyard, where there was nothing but a dustbin and a few weeds. Hagrid grinned at Harry. "Told you, didn't I? Told you were famous. Even Professor Quirrell was trembling to meet you. Mind you, he's usually trembling."
"Is he always that nervous?"
"Oh, yeah, poor bloke. Brilliant mind. He was fine when he was studying out of books, but then he took a year off to get some sort of first-hand experience. They say he met vampires in the Black Forest, and there was a nasty bit of trouble with a hag. Never been the same since. Scared of the students, scared of his own subject. Now, where's me umbrella?"
"Vampires? Hags?" Harry's head was swimming. Hagrid, meanwhile, was counting bricks on the wall above the dustbin.
3 up, 2 across, he muttered. "Right, stand back, Harry."
He tapped the wall 3 times with the point of his umbrella. The brick he touched quivered. It wriggled in the middle. A small hole appeared. It grew wider and wider. A second later they were facing an archway large enough for Hagrid, an archway onto a cobbled street, which twisted and turned out of sight.
"Welcome," said Hagrid, "to Diagon Alley."
He grinned at Harry's amazement. They stepped through the archway. Harry looked quickly over his shoulder and saw the archway shrink instantly back into a solid wall. The sun shone brightly on a stack of cauldrons outside the nearest shop. Cauldrons, all sizes, copper, brass, pewter, silver, self-stirring, collapsible, and a hand hanging over them.
"Yep, you'll be needing one," said Hagrid. "But we gotta get your money first."
Harry wished he had about 8 more eyes. He turned his head in every direction, and he walked up the street, trying to look at everything at once. The shops, the things outside them, the people doing their shopping. A plump woman outside an apothecary's was shaking her head as they passed, saying, "Dragon liver, 17 sinkers an ounce, they're mad." A low, soft hooting came from a dark shop with a sign saying, "Eclops Owl Emporium. Tawny, Screech, Barn, Brown and Snowy." Several boys about Harry's age had their noses pressed against a window with broomsticks in it. "Look," Harry heard one of them say, "the new Nimbus 2000, fastest ever!" There were shops selling robes, shops selling telescopes, and strange silver instruments Harry had never seen before. Windows stacked with barrels of bat spleens and eel's eyes, tottering piles of spell books, quills, and rolls of parchment, potion bottles, globes of the moon.
"Gringotts,"
said Hagrid. They had reached a snowy white building which towered over the other little shops. Standing beside its burnished bronze doors, wearing a uniform of scarlet and gold, was—
"Yep, that's a goblin,"
said Hagrid quietly, as they walked up the white stone steps towards him. The goblin was about a head shorter than Harry. He had a swarthy, clever face, a pointed beard, and, Harry noticed, very long fingers and feet. He bowed as they walked inside. Now they were facing a second pair of doors, silver this time, with words engraved upon them. "Enter, stranger, but take heed, for what awaits the sin of greed. For those who take but do not earn, must pay most dearly in their turn. So if you seek beneath our floors a treasure that was never yours, thief, if you've been warned, beware of finding more than treasure there."
"Like I said, you'd be mad to try and rob it," said Hagrid.
A pair of goblins bowed them through the silver doors, and they were in a vast marble hall. About 100 more goblins were sitting on high stools behind a long counter, scribbling in large ledgers, weighing coins on brass scales, examining precious stones through eyeglasses. There were too many doors leading off the hall, and there were more goblins showing people in and out of these. Hagrid and Harry made it for the counter.
"Mornin',"
said Hagrid to a free goblin.
We've come to take some money out of Mr. Harry Potter's safe.
You have his key, sir?
Got it here somewhere, said Hagrid, as he started emptying his pockets onto the counter, scattering a handful of mouldy dog biscuits over the goblin's book of numbers. The goblin wrinkled his nose. Harry watched the goblin on their right weighing a pile of rubies as big as glowing coals. Got it, said Hagrid at last, holding up a tiny golden key. The goblin looked at it closely.
That seems to be in order.
And I got a letter here from Professor Dumbledore, said Hagrid importantly, throwing out his chest. It's about the you-know-what in Vault 713. The goblin read the letter carefully.
Very well,
he said, handing it back to Hagrid.
I shall have someone take you down to both vaults. Griphook!
Griphook was another goblin. Once Hagrid had crammed all the dog biscuits back into his pockets, he and Harry followed Griphook towards one of the doors leading off the hall. What's the you-know-what in Vault 713? Harry asked. Can't tell you that, said Hagrid mysteriously. Very secret Hogwarts business. Dumbledore's trusted me. More than my job's worth to tell you that. Griphook held the door open for them. Harry, who had expected more marble, was surprised. They were in a narrow stone passageway lit with flaming torches. It sloped steeply downwards, and there were little railway tracks on the floor. Griplock whistled, and a small cart came hurtling up the tracks towards them. They climbed in, Hagrid with some difficulty, and they were off. At first they just hurtled through a maze of twisting passages. Harry tried to remember left, right, left, middle fork, right, but it was impossible. The rattling cart seemed to know its own way because Griplock wasn't steering. Harry's eyes stung as the cold air rushed past them, but he kept them wide open. Once he thought he saw a burst of fire at the end of a passage, and twisted around to see if it was a dragon. But it was too late. They plunged even deeper, passing an underground lake where huge stalactites and stalagmites grew from the ceiling and the floor. I never knew, Harry called to Hagrid over the noise of the cart. What's the difference between a stalagmite and a stalactite? Stalagmite's got an M in it, said Hagrid. And don't ask me questions just now, I gotta be sick. He did look very green when the cart stopped at last, beside a small door in the passage wall. Hagrid got out and had to lean against the wall to stop his knees trembling. Griplock unlocked the door. A lot of green smoke came billowing out. As it cleared, Harry gasped. Inside there were mounds of gold coins, columns of silver, heaps of little bronze knots. All yours, smiled Hagrid. All Harry's. It was incredible. The Dursleys couldn't have known about this, or they'd have had it from him faster than blinking. How often they'd complained about how Harry cost them to keep. And all the time there had been a small fortune belonging to him, buried deep under London. Hagrid helped Harry pile some of it into a bag. The gold ones are galleons, he explained. 17 silver sickles to a galleon, and 29 nuts to a sickle. It's easy enough. Right, that should be enough for a couple of terms. We'll keep the rest safe for you. He turned to Griplock. Vault 713, please. And can we go more slowly?
1 speed only,
said Griplock. They were going even deeper now and gathering speed. The air became colder and colder as they hurtled round tight corners. They went rattling over an underground ravine, and Harry leant over the side to try and see what was down at the dark bottom, but Hagrid groaned and pulled him back by the scruff of the neck. Vault 713 had no keyhole.
Stand back,
said Griphook importantly. He stroked the door gently with one of his long fingers, and it simply melted away.
If anyone but Gringotts Goblin tried that, they'd be sucked through the door and trapped in there, said Griphook.
How often do you check to see if anyone's inside? Harry asked.
About once every 10 years,
said Griphook, with a rather nasty grin. Something really extraordinary had to be inside this top security vault. Harry was sure. And he leant forward eagerly, expecting to see fabulous jewels at the very least.
but at first he thought it was empty. Then he noticed a grubby little package wrapped up in a brown paper, lying on the floor. Hagrid picked it up and tucked it deep inside his coat. Harry longed to know what it was, but knew better than to ask.
Come on, back on this infernal cart, and don't talk to me on the way back. It's best I keep me mouth shut,
said Hagrid. One wild cart ride later, they stood blinking in the sunlight outside Gringotts. Harry didn't know where to run first now that he had a bag full of money. He didn't have to know how many galleons there were to a pound to know that he was holding more money than he'd ever had in his whole life. More money than even Dudley had ever had.
Might as well get your uniform,
said Hagrid, nodding towards Madame Malcolm's robes for all occasions.
Listen, Harry, would you mind if I slipped off for a pick-me-up in the Leaky Cauldron? I hate them Gringotts carts.
He did still look a bit sick, so Harry entered Madame Malcolm's shop alone, feeling nervous. Madame Malcolm was a squat, smiling witch dressed all in mauve.
"Hogwarts, dear?"
she said. When Harry started to speak,
"Got the lot in here. Another young man being fitted up there right now, in fact."
In the back of the shop, a boy with a pale, pointed face was standing on a footstool while a second witch pinned up his long black robes. Madame Malkin stood Harry on a stool next to him, slipped a long robe over his head, and began to pin it to the right length. "Hello," said the boy. "Hogwarts too?" "Yes," said Harry. "My father's next door buying my books, and my mother's up the street looking at wands," said the boy. He had a bored, drawling voice. "Then I'm going to drag them off to look at racing brooms. I don't see why first years can't have their own. I think I'll bully my father into getting one, and I'll smuggle it in somehow." Harry was strongly reminded of Dudley. "Have you got your own broom?" the boy went on. "No," said Harry. "Play Quidditch at all?" "No," Harry said again, wondering what on earth Quidditch could be. "I do. Father says it's a crime if I had not been picked to play for my house. And I must say I agree. Know what your house will be yet?" "No," said Harry, feeling more stupid by the minute. "Well, no one really knows when they get there, do they? But I know I'll be in Slytherin. All of our family have been. Imagine being in Hufflepuff. I think I'd leave, wouldn't you?" Said Harry, wishing he could say something a bit more interesting. "I say, look at that man," said the boy suddenly, nodding towards the front window. Hagrid was standing there, grinning at Harry and pointing at 2 large ice creams to show he couldn't come in. "That's Hagrid," said Harry, pleased to know something the boy didn't. "He works at Hogwarts." "Oh," said the boy. "I've heard of him. He's a sort of servant, isn't he?" He's the gamekeeper," said Harry. He was liking the boy less and less every second. "Yes, exactly. I've heard he's some sort of savage. Lives in a hut in the school grounds. And every now and then he gets drunk, tries to do magic and ends up setting fire to his bed." "I think he's brilliant," said Harry coldly. "You do?" said the boy with a slight sneer. "Why is he with you? Where are your parents?" They're dead," said Harry shortly. He couldn't feel much like going to the matter with this boy. "Oh, sorry," said the other, not sounding sorry at all. "But they were our kind, weren't they?" "Well, they were a witch and a wizard, if that's what you mean. I really don't think they should let the other sort in, do you? They're not the same. They've never been brought up to know our ways. Some of them have never even heard of Hogwarts until they get the letter. Imagine! I think they should keep it in the old wizarding families. What's your surname, anyway?" But before Harry could answer, Madame Malkin said, "That's you done, my dear." And Harry, not sorry for an excuse to stop talking to the boy, hopped down from the footstool. "Well, I'll see you at Hogwarts, I suppose," said the drawling boy. Harry was rather quiet as he ate the ice cream Hagrid had bought him. Chocolate and raspberry with chopped nuts.
"What's up?"
said Hagrid. "Nothing," Harry lied. But they stopped to buy parchment and quills. Harry cheered up a bit when they found the bottle of ink that changed colour as you wrote. When they had left the shop, he said, "Hagrid, what's Quidditch?"
"Blimey, Harry, I keep forgetting how little you know. Not knowing about Quidditch."
"Don't make me feel worse," said Harry. He told Hagrid about the pale boy in Madame Malkin's. "And he said people from Muggle families shouldn't even be allowed in."
"You're not from a Muggle family. If he'd known who you were, he's grown up knowing your name if his parents were risen folk. You saw him in the Leaky Cauldron. Anyway, what does he know about it? Some of the best I ever saw were the only ones with magic in them from a long line of Muggles. Look at your mum. Look what she had for a sister."
"So, what is Quidditch?"
"It's our sport. Wizard sport. It's like football in Muggle world. Everyone follows Quidditch. Played up in the air on broomsticks, and there's 4 balls. Sort of hard to explain the rules."
"And what are Slytherin and Hufflepuff?"
"School houses. There's 4. Everyone says Hufflepuff are the old duffers, but..."
"I bet I'm in Hufflepuff," said Harry gloomily.
"Better Hufflepuff than Slytherin,"
said Hagrid darkly.
"There's not a single witch or wizard who went bad who wasn't from Slytherin. You know who was one."
You know who was in Hogwarts?"
"Years and years ago," said Hagrid.
They bought Harry's school books from a shop called Flourish and Blount's, where the shelves were stacked to the ceiling with books as large as paving stones bound in leather, books the size of postage stamps covered in silk, books full of peculiar symbols, and a few books with nothing in them at all. Even Dudley, who had never read anything, would have gone wild to get his hands on some of these. Hagrid almost had to drag Harry away from curses and counter-curses. Bewitch your friends and befuddle your enemies with the latest ravages, hair loss, jelly legs, tongue-tying, and much, much more, by Professor Vindictus Viridian. I was trying to find out how to curse Dudley.
"I'm not saying that's not a good idea, but you're not to use your magic in the Muggle world, except in very special circumstances," said Hagrid. "And anyway, you couldn't work on any of these curses yet. You'll need a lot more study before you get to that level."
Hagrid wouldn't let Harry buy a single gold cauldron either.
"It says pewter on their list."
But they got a nice set of scales for weighing potion ingredients, and a collapsible brass telescope. Then they visited the apothecary's, which was fascinating enough to make up for its horrible smell, a texture of bad eggs and rotted cabbages. Barrels of slimy stuff stood on the floor. Jars of herbs, dried root, and bright powders lined the walls. Bundles of feathers, strings of fangs, and gnarled claws hung from the ceiling. While Hagrid asked the man behind the counter for a supply of some basic potion ingredients for Harry, Harry himself examined silver unicorn horns at 21 galleons, and a minuscule, glittery black beetle eyes, 5 nuts a scoop. And minuscule, glittery black beetle eyes, 5 nuts a scoop. Outside the apothecary's, Hagrid checked Harry's list again.
"Just your 1 left. Oh yeah, and I still haven't got you a birthday present."
Harry felt himself go red. "Oh, you don't have to."
"I know I don't have to. Tell you what, I'll get you an animal. Not a toad. Toads went out of fashion years ago. You'd be laughed at. And I don't like cats. They make me sneeze. I'll get you an owl. All the kids want owls. They're dead useful, carrying your post and everything."
20 minutes later, they left Elop's Owl Emporium, which had been dark and full of rustling and flickering, jewel-bright eyes. Harry now carried a large cage, which held a beautiful snowy owl, fast asleep, with her head under her wing. He couldn't stop stammering his thanks. Sounded like Professor Quirrell.
"Don't mention it,"
said Harry gruffly.
"Don't expect you've had a lot of presents from the Dursleys. Just Ollivanders left now. Only place for one's Ollivanders, and you gotta have the best wand."
A magic wand. This was what Harry had been really looking forward to. The last shop was narrow and shabby. Peeling gold letters over the door read Ollivanders, makers of fine wands since 382 BC. A single wand lay on the faded purple cushion on the dusty window. A tinkling bell rang somewhere in the depths of the shop as they stepped inside. It was a tiny place. except for a single spindly chair, which Hagrid sat on to wait. Harry felt strangely as though he had entered a very strict library. He swallowed a lot of new questions which had just occurred to him, and looked instead at the thousands of narrow boxes piled neatly right up to the ceiling. For some reason, the back of his neck pricked. The very dust and silence in here seemed to tingle with some secret magic. "Good afternoon," said a soft voice. Harry jumped. Hagrid must have jumped too, because there was a loud crunching noise, and he got quickly off the spindly chair. An old man was standing before them, his wide, pale eyes shining like moons through the gloop of the shop. "Hello," said Harry awkwardly. "Ah, yes," said the man. Yes, I thought I'd be seeing you soon, Harry Potter." It wasn't a question. "You have your mother's eyes. It seems only yesterday she was here herself, buying her first wand. 10¼ inches long, swishy, made of willow. Nice wand for charm work." Mr. Ollivander moved closer to Harry. Harry wished he could blink. Those silvery eyes were a bit creepy. "Your father, on the other hand, favoured a mahogany wand, 11 inches, pliable. A little more power and excellent for transfiguration. Well, I say your father favoured it. It's really the wand that chooses the wizard, of course." Mr. Ollivander had come so close that he and Harry were almost nose to nose. Harry could see himself reflected in those misty eyes. "And that's where—" Mr. Ollivander touched the lightning scar on Harry's forehead with a long white finger. "I'm sorry to say that I sold the wand that did it," he said softly. 13½ inches. Powerful wand, very powerful, and in the wrong hands. Well, if I had known what that wand was going out into the world to do—" He shook his head and then, to Harry's relief, spotted Hagrid. Rubus Hagrid, how nice to see you again. Oak, 16 inches, rather bendy, wasn't it?"
"It was, sir, yes," said Hagrid.
"Good one, that one. But I expect they snapped it in half when you got expelled," said Mr. Ollivander, suddenly stern.
Yes, they did, yes," said Hagrid, shuffling his feet. "I've still got the pieces, though," he added brightly.
"But you don't use them," said Mr. Ollivander sharply.
"Oh, no, sir,"
said Hagrid quickly. Harry noticed he gripped his pink umbrella very tightly as he spoke. Said Mr. Ollivander, giving Hagrid a piercing look. "Well now, Mr. Potter, let me see." He pulled a long tape measure with silver markings out of his pocket. "Which is your wand arm?" Well, I'm right-handed," said Harry. "Hold out your arm, that's it." He measured Harry from his shoulder to his finger, then wrist to elbow, shoulder to floor, knee to armpit, and round the head. As he measured, he said, "Every Ollivander wand has a core of a powerful magic substance. Mr. Potter, we use unicorn hairs, phoenix tail feathers, and the heartstrings of dragons. No two Ollivander wands are the same, just as no two unicorns, dragons, phoenixes are quite the same. And, of course, you will never get good results from another wizard's wand." Harry suddenly realized that the tape measure, which was measuring between his nostrils, was doing its own thing. Mr. Ollivander was flitting about the shelves, taking down boxes. "That will do," he said, and the tape measure crumpled into a heap on the floor. "Right then, Mr. Potter, try this one. Beechwood and dragon heartstring, 9 inches, nice and flexible. Just take it and give it a wave." Harry took the wand and, feeling foolish, waved it around a bit, but Mr. Ollivander snatched it out of his hands almost at once. "Maple and phoenix feather, 7 inches. Quite whippy. Try." Harry tried, but he hardly raised the wand when it, too, was snatched back by Mr. Ollivander. No, here, ebony and unicorn hair, 8½ inches, springy. Go on, try it out." Harry tried, and tried. He had no idea what Mr. Ollivander was waiting for. The pile of tried wands was mounting higher and higher on the spindly chair, But the more wands Mr. Ollivander pulled off the shelves, the happier he seemed to become.
Tricky customer, eh? Not to worry. We'll find the perfect match here somewhere. I wonder now. Yes, why not? The unusual combination. Holly and phoenix feather. 11 inches, nice and supple.
Harry took the wand. He felt a sudden warmth in his fingers. He raised the wand above his head, brought it swishing down through the dusty air, and a stream of red and gold sparks shot from the end like a firework, throwing dancing spots of light onto the walls. Hagrid whooped and clapped, and Mr. Ollivander cried,
"Oh, bravo! Yes, indeed. Oh, yeah, very good. Well, 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 how curious. How very curious."
He put Harry's wand back into its box, and wrapped it in brown paper, still muttering,
"Curious, curious."
"Sorry," said Harry, "but what's curious?" Mr. Ollivander fixed Harry with a pale stare.
"I remember every wand I've ever sold, Mr. Potter. Every single wand. It so happens that the phoenix whose tail feather is in your wand gave another feather, just one other. It was very curious indeed that you should be destined for this wand when its brother gave you that scar."
Harry swallowed.
"Yes, 13.5 inches. You. Curious indeed how these things happen. The one chooses the wizard, remember, and we must expect great things from you, Mr. Potter. After all, he who should not be named did great things. Terrible, yes, but great."
Harry shivered. He wasn't sure he liked Mr. Ollivander too much. He paid 7 gold galleons for his wand, and Mr. Ollivander bowed them from his shop. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, and Harry and Hagrid made their way back down Diagon Alley, back through the wall, back through the leaky cauldron, now empty. Harry didn't speak at all as they walked down the road. He didn't even notice how many people were gawping at them on the underground. Laden they were with their funny-shaped packages, with the sleeping snowy owl on Harry's lap. Up another escalator out onto Paddington Station. Harry only realized where they were when Hagrid tapped him on the shoulder.
"Got time for a bite to eat before your train leaves," he said.
He bought Harry a hamburger, and they sat down on plastic seats to eat them. Harry kept looking around. Everything looked so strange somehow.
"You all right, Harry? You're very quiet," said Hagrid.
Harry wasn't quite sure he could explain. He just had the best birthday of his life, and yet he chewed his hamburger, trying to find the words. "Everyone thinks I'm special," he said at last. "All those people in the leaky cauldron, Professor Quirrell, Mr. Ollivander, but I don't know anything about magic at all. How can they expect great things? I'm famous and I can't even remember what I'm famous for. I don't even know what happened when... the night my parents died." Hagrid leant towards the table. Behind the wild beard and eyebrows, he wore a very kind smile.
"Don't you worry, Harry. You'll learn fast enough. Everyone starts at the beginning at Hogwarts. You'll be just fine. Just be yourself. I know it's hard. You've been singled out, and that's always hard. But you'll have a great time at Hogwarts. I did. Still do, as a matter of fact."
Hagrid helped Harry onto the train that would take him back to the Dursleys, then handed him an envelope.
"Your tickets for Hogwarts," he said. "1st of September, King's Cross. It's all on your ticket. Any problems with the Dursleys, send me a letter with your owl. She'll know where to find me. See you soon, Harry."
The train pulled out of the station. Harry wanted to watch Hagrid until he was out of sight. He rose in his seat and pressed his nose against the window, but he blinked and Hagrid had gone. Chapter 6. The Journey from Platform 9 3/4. Harry's last month with the Dursleys wasn't fun. True, Dudley was now so scared of Harry he wouldn't stay in the same room, while Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon didn't shut Harry in his cupboard, force him to do anything, or shout at him. In fact, they didn't speak to him at all. Half terrified, half furious, they acted as though any chair with Harry in it was empty. Although this was an improvement in many ways, It did become a bit depressing after a while. Harry kept to his room, with his new owl for company. He had decided to call her Hedwig, a name he found in a history of magic. His school books were very interesting. He lay on his bed reading late into the night, Hedwig swooping in and out of the open window as she pleased. It was lucky that Aunt Petunia didn't come in to hoover anymore, because Hedwig kept bringing back dead mice. Every night before he went to sleep, Harry ticked off another day on a piece of paper he had pinned to the wall, counting down to September the 1st. On the last day of August, he thought he'd better speak to his aunt and uncle about getting to King's Cross Station the next day. So he went down into the living room, where they were watching a quiz show on television. He cleared his throat to let them know he was there, and Dudley screamed and ran from the room. Uncle Vernon? Uncle Vernon grunted to show he was listening. I need to be at King's Cross tomorrow, to go to Hogwarts. Uncle Vernon grunted again. Would it be all right if you gave me a lift? Grunt. Harry supposed that meant yes. Thank you. He was about to go upstairs when Uncle Vernon actually spoke. Funny way to get to a wizard's school. The train. Magic carpets got all punches, have they? Harry didn't say anything. Where is this school, anyway? I don't know, said Harry, realizing this for the first time. He pulled the ticket Hagrid had given him out of his pocket. I just take the train from platform 9 3/4 at 11 o'clock, he read. His aunt and uncle stared. Platform what? 9 3/4. Don't talk rubbish, said Uncle Vernon. There is no platform 9 3/4. It's on my ticket. Barking, said Uncle Vernon. Howling mad. The lot of 'em. You'll see. You'll just wait. All right. We'll take you to King's Cross. We're going up London tomorrow anywhere, or I wouldn't have bother. Why are you going to London? Harry asked, trying to keep things friendly. Taking Dudley to hospital, growled Uncle Vernon. Got to have that ruddy tail removed before he goes to Smelton's. Harry woke at 5 o'clock the next morning, and was too excited and nervous to go back to sleep. He got up and pulled on his jeans because he didn't want to walk to the station with his wizard's robes. He'd change on the train. He checked his Hogwarts list yet again to make sure he had everything he needed, saw that Hedwig was shut safely in her cage, and then paced the room, waiting for the Dursleys to get up. 2 hours later, Harry's huge, heavy trunk had been loaded into the Dursleys' car. Aunt Petunia had talked Dudley into sitting next to Harry, and they had set off. They reached King's Cross at 10:30. Uncle Vernon dumped Harry's truck onto the trolley and wheeled it into the station for him. Harry thought this was strangely kind until Uncle Vernon stopped dead, facing the platforms with a nasty grin on his face. Well, there you are, boy. Platform 9, platform 10. Your platform should be somewhere in the middle. But they don't seem to have built it yet, do they? He was quite right, of course. There was a big plastic number 9 over one platform, and a big plastic number 10 over the one next to it. And in the middle, nothing at all. Have a good term, said Uncle Vernon, with an even nastier smile. He left without another word. Harry turned and saw the Dursleys drive away. All three of them were laughing. Harry's mouth went rather dry. What on earth could he do? He was starting to attract a lot of funny looks because of Hedwig. He'd have to ask someone. He stopped a passing guard, but he didn't dare mention platform 9 3/4. The guard had never heard of Hogwarts, and when Harry couldn't even tell him what part of the country it was, he started to get annoyed, as though Harry was being stupid on purpose. Getting desperate, Harry asked for the train that left at 11 o'clock, but the guard said there wasn't one. In the end, the guard strode away, muttering about time-wasters. Harry was now trying hard not to panic. According to the large clock over the arrivals board, he had 10 minutes left to get on the train to Hogwarts, and he had no idea how to do it. He was stranded in the middle of a station with a trunk he could hardly lift, a pocket full of wizard money, and a large owl. Hagrid must have forgotten to tell him something he had to do, like tapping the third brick on the left to get into Diagon Alley. He wondered if he should take out his wand and start tapping the ticket box between platforms 9 and 10. At that moment a group of people passed just behind him, and he caught a few words of what they were saying. "Packed with muggles, of course." Harry swung around. The speaker was a plump woman who was talking to 4 boys, all with flaming hair. Each of them was pushing a trunk like Harry's in front of him, and they all had an owl. Heart hammering, Harry pushed his trolley after them. They stopped, and so did he, just near enough to hear what they were saying. "Now what's the platform number?" asked the boy's mother. 9 3/4, piped a small girl, also red-headed, who was holding her mum's hand. "Mum, can't I go?" "You're not old enough, Ginny. Now be quiet." "All right, Percy, you go first." What looked like the oldest boy marched towards platform 9 and 10. Harry watched, careful not to blink in case he missed it. But just as the boy reached the divide between the 2 platforms, a large crowd of tourists came swarming in front of him, and by the time the last rucksack had cleared away, the boy had vanished. "Fred, you're next," the plump woman said. "I'm not Fred, I'm George," said the boy. "Honestly, woman, call yourself our mother. Can't you tell I'm George?" "Sorry, George, dear." "Only joking, I am Fred," said the boy, and off he went. His twin called after him to hurry up. And he must have done, because a second later he had gone. But how had he done it? Now the third brother was walking briskly towards the ticket barrier. He was almost there, and then, quite suddenly, he wasn't anywhere. There was nothing else for it. "Excuse me," Harry said to the plump woman. "Hello, dear," she said. "First time at Hogwarts? Ron's new too." She pointed at the last and youngest of her sons. He was tall, thin, and gangling, with freckles, big hands and feet, and a long nose. "Yes," said Harry. "The thing is, I don't know how to get on the platform," she said kindly. And Harry nodded. "Not to worry," she said. "All you have to do is walk straight at the barrier between the platforms 9 and 10. Don't stop and don't be scared, or you'll crash into it. That's very important. Best to do it at a bit of a run if you're nervous. Go on. Go now before Ron." Okay," said Harry. He pushed his trolley round and stared at the barrier. It looked very solid. He started to walk towards it. People jostled him on the way to the platforms 9 and 10. Harry walked more and more quickly. He was going to smash right into that ticket box, and then he'd be in trouble. Leaning forward on his trolley, he broke into a heavy run. The barrier was coming nearer and nearer. He wouldn't be able to stop. The trolley was out of control. He was a foot away. He closed his eyes, ready for the crash. It didn't come. He kept running. He opened his eyes. A scarlet steam engine was waiting next to a platform marked with people. A sign overhead said Hogwarts Express, 11 o'clock. Harry looked behind him and saw a wrought iron archway where the ticket box had been, with the words Platform 9 3/4 on it. He had done it. Smoke from the engine drifted over the heads of the chattering crowd, while cats of every colour wound here and there between their legs. Owls hooted to each other in a disgruntled sort of way, over the babble of the scraping of heavy trunks. The first of few carriages were already packed with students, some hanging out of the window to talk to their families, some fighting over seats. Harry pushed his trolley off down the platform in search of an empty seat. He passed a round-faced boy who was saying, "Gran, I've lost my toad again." "Oh, Neville," he heard the old woman sigh. A boy with dreadlocks was surrounded by a small crowd. "Give us a look, Lee. Go on." The boy lifted the lid of the box in his arms, and the people around him shrieked and yelled as something inside poked out a long, hairy leg. Harry pressed on through the crowd until he found an empty compartment near the end of the train. He put Hedwig inside first and then started to shove and heave his trunk towards the train door. He tried to lift it up onto the steps, but he could hardly raise one end, and twice he dropped it painfully onto his foot. "Want a hand?" It was one of the red-haired twins he'd followed through the ticket box. "Yes, please," Harry panted. "Oi, Fred, come here and help." With the twins' help, Harry's trunk was at last tucked away in the corner of the compartment. "Thanks," said Harry, pushing his sweaty hair out of his eyes. "What's that?" said one of the twins, suddenly pointing at Harry's lightning scar. "Blimey, are you—" "He is, aren't you?" he added to Harry. "What?" said Harry. "Harry Potter!" chorused the twins. "Oh, him," said Harry. "I mean, yes, I am." The two boys gawped at him, and Harry felt himself going red. Then, to his relief, a voice came floating in through the train's open door. "Fred, George, are you there?" "Coming, Mum." With a last look at Harry, the twins hopped off the train. Harry sat next to the window, where, half hidden, he could watch the red-haired family on the platform and hear what they were saying. Their mother had just taken out her handkerchief. "Ron, you've got something on your nose." The youngest boy tried to jerk out of the way, but she grabbed him and began rubbing the end of his nose. "Mum, ugh." He wriggled free. "Has Iku Ronnie got something on his nosey?" said one of the twins. "Shut up," said Ron. "Where's Percy?" said their mother. "He's coming now." The oldest boy came striding into sight. He had already changed into his billowing black Hogwarts robes, and Harry noticed a shiny silver badge on his chest with the letter P on it. "Can't stay long, Mother," he said. "I'm up front. The prefects have got compartments to themselves." "Oh, you're a prefect, Percy," said one of the twins with an air of surprise. "You should have said something. We had no idea." "Oh, hang on. I think I remember him saying something about it," said the other twin. "Once. Or twice. A minute. All summer." "Oh, shut up," said Percy, the prefect. "How come Percy gets all new robes, anyway?" said one of the twins. "Because he's a prefect," said their mother fondly. "All right, dear, we'll have a good term. And send me an owl when you get there." She kissed Percy on the cheek and he left. Then she turned to the twins. "Now you two, this year you behave yourselves. If I get one more owl telling me you've blown up a toilet or—" "Blown up a toilet? We've never blown up a toilet." "Great idea, though. Thanks, Mum." "That's not funny. And look after Ron." "Don't worry. Iku Rodikins is safe with Das." "Shut up," said Ron again. He was almost as tall as the twins already, and his nose was still pink where his mother had rubbed it. "Hey, Mum, guess what? Guess who we just met on the train?" Harry leant back quickly so they couldn't see him looking. "You know that black-haired boy who was near us in the station? You know who he is?" "Who?" "Harry Potter!" Harry heard the girl's voice. "Oh, Mum, can we go into the train and see him, please? Oh, please." "You've already seen him, Guinea. And the poor boy isn't something that you goggle at in a zoo." "Is he really, Fred? How do you know?" "Asked him. Saw his scar. It's really there, like lightning." Poor dear. No wonder he was alone. I wondered. He was ever so polite when he asked how to get onto the platform. "Never mind that. Do you think he remembers what you-know-who looks like?" Their mother suddenly became very stern. "I forbid you to ask him. Fred, no, don't you dare." As though he needs reminding of that on his first day at school. "All right, keep your hair on." A whistle sounded. "Hurry up," their mother said. And the three boys clambered onto the train. They leant out of the window for her to kiss them goodbye, and their younger sister began to cry. "Don't. Guinea, we'll send you loads of owls." "We'll send you a Hogwarts toilet seat." "George." "Only kidding, Mum." The train began to move. Harry saw the boys' mother waving, and their sister, half laughing, half crying, running to keep up with the train until it gathered too much speed, and then she fell back and waved. Harry watched the girl and her mother disappear as the train rounded the corner. Houses flashed past the window. Harry felt a great leap of excitement. He didn't know what he was going to do, but it had to be better than what he was leaving behind. The door of the compartment slid open, and the youngest red-headed boy came in. "Anyone else there?" he asked, pointing at the seat opposite Harry. "Everywhere else is full." Harry shook his head and the boy sat down. He glanced at Harry, and then he looked out the window, pretending he hadn't looked. Harry saw he still had a black mark on his nose. "Hey, Ron,
The twins were back. "Listen, we're going down the middle of the train. Lee Jordan's got a giant tarantula down there." "Right," mumbled Ron. "Harry," said the other twin, "did we introduce ourselves? Fred and George Weasley. And this is Ron, our brother. See you later, then." "Bye," said Harry and Ron. The twins slid the compartment door shut behind them. "Are you really Harry Potter?" Ron blurted out. Harry nodded. "Oh, well, I thought it might be one of Fred and George's jokes," said Ron. "And have you really got, you know?" He pointed at Harry's forehead. Harry pulled back his fringe to show the lightning scar. Ron stared. "So that's where you know who—" "Yes," said Harry, "but I can't remember it." "Nothing?" said Ron eagerly. "Well, I remember a lot of green light, but nothing else." "Wow!" said Ron. He sat and stared at Harry for a few moments. Then, as though he had suddenly realized what he was doing, he looked quickly out the window. "Are all your family wizards?" said Harry, who found Ron just as interesting as Ron found him. Yes, I think so," said Ron. "I think Mum's got a second cousin who's an accountant, but we never talk about him." "So you must know loads about magic already." The Weasleys were clearly one of those old wizarding families the pale boy in Diagon Alley had talked about. "I heard you went to live with Muggles," said Ron. "What are they like?" "Horrible. Well, not all of them. My aunt and my uncle and my cousin are, though. I wished I had 3 wizard brothers." Five, said Ron for some reason. He was looking gloomy. "I'm the 6th in our family to go to Hogwarts. You could say I've got a lot to live up to. Bill and Charlie have already left. Bill was the head boy and Charlie was a captain of Quidditch. Now Percy's a prefect. Fred and George mess around a lot, but they still get really good marks and everyone thinks they're really funny. Everyone expects me to do as well as the others, but if I do, it's no big deal. Because they did it first. You never get anything new either. With 5 brothers, I've got Bill's old robes, Charlie's old wand, and Percy's old rat." Ron reached inside his jacket and pulled out a fat, grey rat, which was asleep. "His name's Scabbers, and he's useless. He hardly ever wakes up. Percy got an owl from my dad for being a prefect, but they couldn't have... I got Scabbers instead." Ron's ears went pink. He seemed to think he'd said too much, because he went back to staring out the window. Harry didn't think there was anything wrong with not being able to afford an owl. After all, he'd never had any money in his life until a month ago. And he told Ron. So, all about having to wear Dudley's old clothes and never getting proper birthday presents, this seemed to cheer Ron up. "And until Hagrid told me, I didn't know anything about being a wizard, or about my parents, or Voldemort." Ron gasped. "What?" You said you know whose name," said Ron, sounding both shocked and impressed. "I'd have thought you of all people." "I'm not trying to be brave or anything, just saying the name," said Harry. "I just never knew you shouldn't. See what I mean? I've got loads to learn, I bet," he added, voicing for the first time something that had been worrying him a lot lately. "I bet I'm the worst in the class." "You won't be. There's loads of people who come from Muggle families, and they learn quick enough." While they had been talking, the train had carried them out of London. Now they were speeding past fields full of cows and sheep. They were quiet for a while, watching the fields and lanes flick past. Around 12:30, there was a great clattering outside the corridor, and a smiling, dimpled woman slid back their door and said, "Anything off the trolleys, dears?" Harry, who hadn't had any breakfast, leapt to his feet. But Ron's ears went pink again, and he muttered that he brought sandwiches. Harry went out into the corridor. He had never had any money for sweets with the Dursleys, and now that he had pockets rattling with gold and silver, he was ready to buy as many Mars bars he could carry. But the woman didn't have Mars bars. What she did have were Bertie Bott's, every flavour beans, Droobles, best blowing gum, chocolate frogs, pumpkin pastries, cauldron cakes, licorice wands, and a number of other strange things Harry had never seen in his life.
Not wanting to miss everything, he got some of everything, and paid the woman 11 silver sickles and 7 bronze nuts. Ron stared as Harry brought them all back into the compartment and tipped it onto the empty seat. "Hungry, are you?" "Starving," said Harry, taking a large bite out of a pumpkin pastry. Ron had taken out a lumpy package and unwrapped it. There were 4 sandwiches in there. He pulled one of them apart and said, "She always forgets I don't like corned beef." "Swap you for one of these," said Harry, holding up a pastry. "Go on." "You don't want this. It's all dry," said Ron. "She hasn't got much time," he added quickly. "You know, with 5 of us." "Go on, have a pastry," said Harry, who had never had anything to share before, or indeed anyone to share it with. It was a nice feeling, sitting there with Ron, eating their way through all Harry's pastries and cakes. The sandwiches lay forgotten. "What are these?" Harry asked Ron, holding up a pack of chocolate frogs. "They're not really frogs, are they?" He was starting to feel that nothing would surprise him. "No," said Ron, "but see what the card is. I'm missing Agrippa." "What?" "Oh, of course you wouldn't know. Chocolate frogs have cards inside them, you know, to collect. Famous witches and wizards. I've got about 500, but I haven't got Agrippa or Ptolemy." Harry unwrapped his chocolate frog and picked up the card. It showed a man's face. He wore half-moon glasses and a long crooked nose and flowing silver hair, beard and moustache. Underneath the picture was the name Albus Dumbledore. "So this is Dumbledore," said Harry. "Don't tell me you've never heard of Dumbledore," said Ron. "Can I have a frog? I might get Agrippa. Thanks." Harry turned over his card and read, "Albus Dumbledore, currently headmaster of Hogwarts, considered by many the greatest wizard of modern times. Professor Dumbledore is particularly famous for the defeat of the dark wizard Grindelwald in 1945, for the discovery of 12 uses of dragon's blood, and his work on alchemy with his partner Nicholas Flamel. Professor Dumbledore enjoys chamber music and 10-pin bowling." Harry turned the card back over and saw, to his astonishment, that Dumbledore's face had disappeared. "He's gone." "Well, you can't expect him to hang around all day," said Ron. "He'll be back." "No, I've got Morgana again. I've got about 6 of her. You want it? You can start collecting." Ron's eyes strayed to the pile of chocolate frogs waiting to be unwrapped. "Help yourself," said Harry. "But in, the Muggle world, people just stay put in photos." "Do they? What, they don't move at all?" Ron sounded amazed. "Weird." Harry stared as Dumbledore sided back onto the picture on his card and gave him a small smile. Ron was more interested in eating the frogs than looking at the famous witches and wizards. But Harry couldn't keep his eyes off them. Soon he had not only Dumbledore and Morgana, but Hengeist of Woodcroft, Alberic Grunion, Circe, Parisius, and Merlin. He finally tore his eyes away from the druidess Cleonda, who was scratching her nose to open a bag of Bertie Bott's every-flavoured beans. "You want to be careful with those," Ron warned Harry. "When they say every flavour, they mean every flavour. You get all the ordinary ones like chocolate and peppermint and marmalade, but then you get spinach and liver and tripe. George reckons he had a boogie-flavoured one once." Ron picked up a green bean, looked at it carefully, and bit into the corner. "Yuck! See? Sprouts!" They had a good time eating every-flavoured beans. Harry got toast, coconut, baked beans, strawberry, curry, grass, coffee, sardine, and was even brave enough to nibble the end of a funny grey one Ron wouldn't touch, which turned out to be pepper. The countryside now flying past the window was becoming wilder. The neat fields had gone. Now there were woods, twisting rivers and dark green hills. There was a knock on the door of their compartment, and a round-faced boy Harry had passed on the platform 9 3/4 came in. He looked tearful. "Sorry," he said, "but have you seen a toad at all?" When they shook their heads, he wailed, "I've lost him! He keeps on getting away from me." "He'll turn up," said Harry. "Yes," said the boy miserably. "Well, if you see him." He left. "I don't know why he's so bothered," said Ron. "If I had bought a toad, I'd lose it as quick as I could. Mind you, I brought Scabbers, so I can't talk." The rat was still snoozing on Ron's lap. "He might have died, and you wouldn't know the difference," said Ron in disgust. "I tried to turn him yellow yesterday to make him more interesting, but the spell didn't work. I'll show you, look." He rummaged around his trunk and pulled out a very battered-looking wand. It was chipped in places, and something white was glinting at the end. "Unicorn's hair's nearly poking out. Anyway," he had just raised his wand when the compartment door slid open again. The toadless boy was back, but this time he had a girl with him. She was already wearing her new Hogwarts robes. "Has anyone seen a toad? Neville's lost one," she said. She had a bossy sort of voice, lots of bushy brown hair, and rather large front teeth. "We've already told him we haven't seen it," said Ron. But the girl wasn't listening. She was looking at the wand in his hand. "Oh, are you doing magic? Let's see then." She sat down. Ron looked taken aback. All right." He cleared his throat. "Sunshine, daisies, buttermellow. Turn this stupid fat rat yellow." He waved his wand, but nothing happened. Scabbard stayed grey and fast asleep. "Are you sure that's a real spell?" said the girl. "Well, it's not very good, is it? I've tried a few simple spells for just this practice, and it's all worked for me. Nobody in my family's magic at all. It was ever such a surprise when I got my letter. But I was ever so pleased, of course. I mean, it's the very best school for witchcraft there is, I've heard. I've learned all my said books off by heart, of course. I just hope it will be enough. I'm Hermione Granger, by the way. Who are you?" She said all of this very fast. Harry looked at Ron and was relieved to see by his stunned face that he hadn't learned all the books off by heart either. "I'm Ron Weasley," Ron muttered. "Harry Potter," said Harry. "Are you really?" said Hermione. "I know all about you, of course. I got a few extra books for background reading, and you're in modern magical history, and the rise and fall of the dark arts, and great wizarding events of the 20th century." "Am I?" said Harry, feeling dazed. "Goodness, didn't you know? I'd have found out everything if it was me," said Hermione. "Do either of you know what house you will be in? I've been asking around, and I hope I'm in Gryffindor. It sounds best by far. I hear Dumbledore himself was one, but I suppose Ravenclaw wouldn't be too bad. Anyway, we'd better go and look for Neville's toad. You two had better change, you know. I expect we'll be there soon." And she left, taking the toadless boy with her. "Whatever house I'm in, I hope she's not in it," said Ron. He threw his wand back into his trunk. "Stupid spell. George gave it me, but I knew it was a dud." "What house are your brothers in?" said Harry. "Gryffindor," said Ron. Gloom seemed to be settling over him. "Mum and Dad were in it too. I don't know what they'll say if I'm not. I don't suppose Ravenclaw would be too bad. But imagine if they put me in Slytherin. That's the house you know who was in." "Yeah," said Ron. He flopped back onto his seat, looking depressed. "You know, I think the ends of Scabbard's whiskers are a bit lighter," said Harry, trying to take Ron's mind off houses. "So what do your older brothers do now that they've left, anyway?" Harry was wondering what a wizard did after he'd finished school. "Charles is in Romania studying dragons, and Bill's in Africa doing something for Gringotts," said Ron. "Did you hear about Gringotts? It's been all over the Daily Prophet. But I don't suppose you get that with the Muggles. Someone tried to rob a high-security vault." Harry stared. "Really? What happened to them?" "Nothing. That's why it's such big news. They haven't been caught. My dad says it must have been a powerful dark wizard to get round Gringotts. But they don't look like they took anything. That's what's odd. Of course, everyone gets scared when something like this happens, in case you know who's behind it." Harry turned this news over in his mind. He was starting to get a prickle of fear every time "you know who" was mentioned. He supposed this was all part of entering the magic world, but it had been a lot more comfortable saying Voldemort without worrying. "What's your Quidditch team?" Ron asked. I don't know any," Harry confessed. "What?" Ron looked dumbfounded. "Oh, you wait, it's the best game in the world." And he was off, explaining about the 4 balls and the positions of the 7 players, describing famous games he'd been to with his brothers, and the broomstick he'd like to get if he had the money. He was just taking Harry through the finer points of the game when the compartment door slid open yet again. But it wasn't Neville the Toadless Boy, or Hermione Granger this time. 3 boys entered, and Harry recognised the middle one at once. It was the pale boy from Madame Malkin's robe shop. He was looking at Harry with a lot more interest than he'd shown back in Diagon Alley.
"Is it true?" he said. "They're saying all down the train that Harry Potter's in this compartment. So it's you, is it?"
"Yes," said Harry. He was looking at the other boys. Both of them were thick-set and looked extremely mean, standing either side of the pale boy, as they looked like bodyguards.
"Oh, this is Crabbe and this is Goyle,"
said the pale boy, carelessly noticing where Harry was looking.
"And my name's Malfoy. Draco Malfoy."
Ron gave a slight cough, which might have been hiding a snigger. Draco Malfoy looked at him.
"Do you think my name's funny, do you? My father told me all the Weasleys have red hair, freckles, and more children than they can afford."
He turned back to Harry.
"You'll soon find out wizarding families are much better than others, Potter. You don't want to make friends with these sort. I can help you there."
He held out his hand to shake Harry's, but Harry didn't take it.
"I think I can tell who the wrong sort of people are for myself, thanks."
Draco Malfoy didn't go red, but a pink tinge appeared in his pale cheeks.
"I'd be careful if I were you, Potter," he said slowly. "Unless you're a bit politer, you'll go the same way as your parents. They didn't know what was good for them either. You hang around with riffraff like the Weasleys and that Hagrid, and it'll rub off on you."
Both Harry and Ron stood up. Ron's face was as red as his hair.
"Say that again," he said. "Oh, you're going to fight us, are you?"
Malfoy sneered. "Unless you get out now," said Harry, more bravely than he felt, because Crabbe and Goyle were a lot bigger than him or Ron.
"But we don't feel like leaving, do we, boys? We've eaten all our food, and you still seem to have some."
Goyle reached towards the chocolate frogs next to Ron. Ron leapt forward, but before so much as touched Goyle, Goyle let out a horrible yell. Scabbers, the rat, was hanging off his finger. Sharp little teeth sunk deep into Goyle's knuckle. Crabbe and Malfoy backed away, as Goyle swung Scabbard round and round, howling. When Scabbers finally flew off and hit the window, all 3 of them disappeared at once. Perhaps they thought there were more rats lurking among the sweets, or perhaps they'd heard footsteps, because a second later Hermione Granger had come in. "What on earth was going on?" she said, looking at all the sweets all over the floor, and Ron picking up Scabbers by his tail.
"I think he's been knocked out,"
Ron said to Harry. He looked closer at Scabbers.
"No, I don't believe it. He's gone back to sleep."
And so he had.
"You've met Malfoy before?"
Harry explained about their meeting in Diagon Alley.
"I've heard about his family," said Ron darkly. "They were some of the first to come back to our side after you-know-who disappeared. They said they'd been bewitched. My dad doesn't believe it. He says Malcolm's father didn't have an excuse to go over to the dark side."
He turned to Hermione.
"Can we help you with something? You better hurry up and put your robes on. I've been up at the front to ask the driver if he sees we're nearly there. You haven't been fighting, have you? You'll be in trouble before we even get there." "Scabbers has been fighting, not us," said Ron, scowling at her. "Would you mind leaving while we change?" "All right. I only came in here because people outside are behaving very childishly, racing up and down the corridors," said Hermione with a sniffling voice. "And you've got dirt on your nose, by the way, did you know?"
Ron glared at her as she left. Harry peered out of the window. It was getting dark. He could see mountains and forests under a deep purple sky. The train did not seem to be slowing down. He and Ron took off their jackets and pulled on their long black robes. Ron's were a bit short for him. You could see his trainers underneath them. A voice echoed through the train. "We will be reaching Hogwarts in 5 minutes' time. Please leave your luggage on the train. It will be taken to the school separately." Harry's stomach turned with nerves, and Ron, he saw, looked pale underneath his freckles. They crammed their pockets with the last of the sweets and joined the crowd thronging the corridor. The train slowed right down and finally stopped. People pushed their way towards the door and out onto a tiny dark platform. Harry shivered in the cold night air. Then a lamp came bobbing over the heads of the students, and Harry heard a familiar voice.
First years over here. All right there, Harry.
Hagrid's big hairy face beamed over the sea of heads.
Come on, follow me. Any more first years? Mind your step now. First years, follow me.
Slipping and stumbling, they followed Hagrid down what seemed to be a steep, narrow path. It was so dark either side of them that Harry thought there must have been thick trees there. Nobody spoke much. Neville, the boy who kept losing his toad, sniffed once or twice.
Yep, get your first sight of Hogwarts in a sack,
Hagrid called over his shoulder.
Just round this bend here.
There was a loud whoo. The narrow path had opened suddenly onto the edge of a great black lake, perched atop a high mountain on the other side. Its windows sparkling in the starry sky, was a vast castle with many turrets and towers.
No more than 4 to a boat,
Hagrid called, pointing to a fleet of little boats sitting in the water by the shore. Harry and Ron were followed into the boat by Neville and Hermione.
Everyone in?
Shouted Hagrid, who had a boat to himself.
Right then, forward.
And the fleet of little boats moved all at once, gliding across the lake, which was as smooth as glass. Everyone was silent, staring up at the great castle overhead. It towered over them as they sailed nearer and nearer to a cliff on which it stood.
Heads down,
yelled Hagrid. As the first boats reached the cliff, they all bent their heads, and the little boats carried them through a curtain of ivy, which had a wide opening on the cliff face. They were carried along a dark tunnel, which seemed to be taking them right underneath the castle, until they reached a kind of underground harbour, where they clambered out onto rocks and pebbles.
Oi, you there! Is this your toad?
Said Hagrid, who was checking the boats as people climbed out of them.
Trevor!
Cried Neville blissfully, holding out his hands. Then they clambered up a passageway in the rock after Hagrid's lamp, coming out at last onto smooth, damp grass right in the shadow of the castle. They walked up a flight of stone steps and crowded around the huge oak front door.
Everyone here? You there, still got your toad?
Hagrid raised a gigantic fist and knocked 3 times on the castle door.